Thank you, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for February 12th, 2024. If you are watching from home, you can go on to the website, www.livoniapublicschools.org, scroll over to board and go down and find agenda, and you'll be able to open that up and you can see everything we're doing tonight. So tonight's meeting is a committee meeting, so we will be discussing lots of things that are on the agenda, so it's a little bit different from our regular meeting, but we welcome you. And we're going to go ahead and start with item number 1, audience communications. I do have one blue slip, so audience communication is a time for the board to listen to the concerns of our constituents. So you'll have our guests will have 3 minutes to speak, and we're going to welcome Mr. Johannes Kaywood. Come on up, and if you have a seat at the table here and you press the red button, it'll turn green, and that'll turn on your speaker.
Green at the bottom of the microphone.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, welcome. Oh, Mrs., who's going to be our timekeeper?
Mr. Johnson.
Oh, Mr. Johnson is. Well, welcome.
All right, great, thank you. Audience communication is my favorite part. The reason I want to talk to you today is, as you know, if a teacher calls in, you get a sub. Occasionally you go and you have positions that go unfulfilled with a regular teacher, and at that point you use a long-term sub. This is someone who goes and acts in the classroom just like any other teacher, except they get paid about a third. They don't get health care, they don't get retirement, they don't get any of the other benefits. And that's okay. It's understandable. It is a sub position. They also, if they go and if the resource person does not show up, they go and they take over those duties as a recess monitor, unpaid, whereas the teacher would have gotten paid. Or if the specialist doesn't show up, again, they take that position unpaid, where the teacher would have been paid. But what I really want to talk to you about is and I've confirmed this with your HR, is what happens when a sub, long-term sub, needs to go and take a day off for a medical leave to go to a doctor. Now, as you progress up the long-term sub, you accumulate days, and after you've been there for so many days, you get paid more. However, if you go and you get sick and you have to take 1 day off, your contract gets restarted. And you lose hundreds, if not thousands of dollars over the next rest of the course of the year. And it really goes and brings into question, well, how are we valuing these people, and how are we valuing the educational services that they are providing those children? Because they are filling in for a teacher who is not there. They are building lesson plans just like a teacher, spending hours after school building lesson plans that are unpaid. And I also want to give one more example. I know of one long-term sub. She went and she took over. She was requested by the principal to go and take that position for the rest of the year. Lo and behold, she applied. Another person also applied. While I believe the principal wanted her, HR chose to go with another route, which was fine. That happens. It's life. But then that other teacher that they hired, shortly after, about 2 months later, says, I'm going to quit and I'm going to leave. And they go back to that original long-term sub who was there from the beginning of the year, teaching those kids, knows those kids. And their only one request was, please go and respect that this is a continuation of my contract. And the answer that came back from HR is no. So if you were a long-term sub providing educational services to those children, how would you feel LPS values your service, and how would you feel they value the education of those children? So that's what I want you to go and do, and I hope you'll consider that policy in the future.
Okay.
I just hit it.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming in. Thank you. Okay. All right. That concludes our audience communications. We're going to move on to item 2, Committee of the Whole, and that would be my committee right now. And I have item A, the consideration of candidates for the MASB Board of Directors. Just wanted to have a little discussion on the candidates that are before us for the MASB Board of Directors role for our region. We're Region 8, and they're 3-year terms. There's Melody Hines from Wayne Westland, and there is, let's see who else we have. Birgit McQuiston, she's currently in that role and has been in that role for several years now. And then the third candidate is Evelyn Pridemore. So in your packet were some information about those members. Does anybody have any preference on who they would like to see represent us in Region 8 for the next 3 years? Mrs. Burton.
Yes, I would support Birgit McQuiston. She has served as a board member for over a decade, I believe. We have all seen her at many classes. She has availed herself to much ongoing education, and she has served in this role and appears to be doing so well. I have no ill will toward either of the other candidates. They also bring valuable characteristics to the position. But at this point, based on her experience, I would support Ms. McQuiston.
Great, thank you, Mrs. Burton. Anybody else have any comments regarding the candidates? I know we talked about this at the study session. I think Birgit, we've all seen her and in her role, and she's done a great job. It's nice to see that there's other candidates that are hopping on board and interested, but I too feel that Birgit would be probably our best candidate for the next 3 years. So if that's the agreement from everybody, we're going to put that on for the vote for, I believe, our next meeting, which is not going to be until
2 weeks.
the 26th, 2 weeks. So if everybody's good with that, we'll call it a day
With
then.
it.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. So we'll move on to item 3, the Finance Committee, and Mrs. Bonifield's our chair. Do you have anything tonight?
I have nothing on the agenda, Superintendent Oquist.
We do not.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That
Mrs.
concludes
Bonifield.
Finance.
Awesome. Moving on to item 4, the Curriculum Committee. I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Acosta.
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're welcome.
Item 4A is limited schools of choice for 2024-2025, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Green.
Thank you, Ms. Acosta. Good evening, everyone. Nice
Good
to see you again. As you know, last week at our study session, we discussed the history and status of our limited schools of choice program, also referred to as 105, 105C. During that meeting, I was grateful to all of you to have the opportunity to review the history of schools of choice within Livonia Public Schools and share various data points that led us to this proposal that I'll be moving forward for next year. But before continuing to discuss the recommendation for next year, you know I like history, so let's take a little journey. I'd like to take a few minutes with our viewing audience to provide an overview of limited schools of choice through 105, 105C. We have offered limited schools of choice since the 2014-15 school year. Limited schools of choice through 105, 105C allows local school districts to enroll non-resident students and count them in membership without having to obtain approval from the districts of residence. Limited schools of choice applications are accepted for a limited number of seats and at specified grade levels. We talked about that last week and how the HR department and myself place students through this process. Limited schools of choice are open to residents of Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, Monroe, and Washtenaw counties, In other words, local districts within Wayne County are those who reside in connecting intermediate school districts. Applications for limited schools of choice are open for 30 days, after which, if necessary, we hold a publicly recorded lottery as needed for certain grade levels. Shortly thereafter, families are accepted, will be notified from our pupil accounting department, and they are invited to register their children with Livonia Public Schools. After that, the elementary department, in partnership with the Human Resources Department, place registered limited schools of choice students into the appropriate grade level at the designated buildings. This process is always done with the utmost care so as not to inflate class sizes in any location. As we discussed last week, during the 23-24 school year, we enrolled approximately 98 students for roughly an additional $950,000 in revenue. In addition to the revenue, these schools of choice placements really help us rebalance class size across the district and fill gaps at various locations without negatively impacting class size. As we also spoke last week, this is a major rationale for our continuing limited schools of choice. When done with care and precision, strategic placement of schools of choice students helps to reduce the possibility of kindergarten overflow at the elementary level and combination classrooms across our school district. As you know, this process didn't start last week. It starts first with an internal review of last year's school choice data, and then we bring forth a recommendation to the board for the upcoming school year. So as such, thinking about that process, thinking about that discussion, thinking about our conversation last week, and I appreciated all the great questions and the discussion on this, we are going to recommend offering up to 165 total seats through the 105 and 105C Schools of Choice program for grades K-4 for the 24-25 school year. We will not be offering limited schools of choice for grades 5 and up. If approved by the Board of Education at the February 26th Board of Education meeting, the application window would then open on March 1st and close on March 31st. On April 12th, if needed, there would be a publicly recorded lottery that would take place as needed for certain grade levels. As a reminder, Niji, Eero, and Webster would conduct separate limited schools of choice windows as they have done in the past. So I would ask that this be a voting item at the February 26, 2024 Board of Education meeting. But in closing, this is a true partnership. I'd like to thank our cabinet team, Mrs. Herbeck in the elementary office, our assessment coordinator, Mr. Hillard, Christine in pupil accounting. She just recently joined our school district, and she's been a fantastic resource for their collective work on putting together our historical overview that we went through last week and for helping make these future recommendations. This annual process is truly a team effort. And at this time, if there's any questions, I'll take those.
Thank you for that history lesson, Mr. Green, reminding us how your team came to this conclusion. Do we have any questions or comments? Mrs. Bonifield.
I would just like to say thank you very much. Every year, we do a deep dive into this, we talk about it, and every year, we decide to do sort of a different configuration of who we're inviting into our district. And I think the biggest thing is that we utilize it to make our school system better. And in that fashion, you know, we decide what we're going to do differently every year. And I just appreciate you taking the time, you and your group taking the time to be able to do that and really looking into it for the best for our kids, making this a thing where, you know, we reduce the split classes and some of the other stuff, being able to round out some of our numbers without just blindly opening up slots every year, because that's the way we've done it every year. So I appreciate the due diligence, and I think it's a real asset for our district to have.
Thank you.
Mrs. Burton.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to give an overview of a few areas.
Sure.
We've talked about them as a board. Probably most of the board knows the answers, but it's because this is a topic that's so important to our public. I know that a lot of folks, these are the perennial questions that come up every year when we start talking about this. Can you please explain for the public how this is different than intra-district schools?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And so, again, these are students who are non-residents of Livonia Public Schools, who we have to have an annual process to enroll them without cooperative agreements from their other school district. So we have to have certain rules we have to follow, which is this process, which is a board approval, and then we have to identify a number of seats, and then we strategically place them. Intra-district transfers are inside of our own school district. So for example, if you are a student who lives in a certain triad or goes to a certain elementary school and your family has an annual request to have them go to a different elementary school within our district, there is a form that they fill out online, and it's advertised on our website. We actually open that window up on February 1st. And Mr. E2, if there's secondary requests, or myself, we review those, and we have a pretty firm decision tree matrix that we use to decide if we're going to approve those intra-district transfer requests. Basically, siblings and continuations are the approvals, and then unresolved issues at schools are another thing we will consider. But for the most part, we, if you look on our literature on our website, We do not want to ever do anything through the intra-district school of choice or the intra-district transfer, and the schools of choice that I spoke of earlier to create shifts in our enrollments in our schools. So that is one of the reasons why we're very precise on this process. And on the intra-district, we start with no, and then maybe we'll get to yes in certain situations. So those are the two differences: resident students, intra-district, non-resident students, schools of choice.
Okay. And as I remember we talked about last week, in situations like that, if we do not put a schools of choice student, meaning someone who's coming from outside of our district, into a given building and grade where we have turned down an
That is correct.
a family who is already a member of Livonia Public Schools.
That is correct.
Okay, which I think is really important to
Yes.
know, because every year we hear about what if that happens, and I think it's important for folks to understand we're locking down that won't
Correct.
happen.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. I think it's important, too, and we've been very, very successful in having this reduce the number of split classes, as you mentioned, and kindergarten overflow. Those are two stressors for families and for students, and frankly, for teaching staff. I think teachers who taught split classes, oh my goodness, there are extra jewels in your crown in heaven for that. I mean, that's a lot. So if we can utilize a process like this and have that help to reduce those extra stressful situations, that is an enormous benefit to doing a schools of choice, as much so, if not at least equally so, to a financial benefit. But that's one of those examples of programming. We talk about that it helps us to continue with strong programming. That's just one example, is reducing split classes wherever possible, and kindergarten overflow, which I haven't heard about in a long time now, which is really, really nice. I think it's important for folks in the public, too, to know that transportation is not provided for this.
That is correct.
That if a family chooses to come into the district, that the transportation is on their own every day.
That is correct.
And then one question I ask every year, and I know the answer by now because I've asked it enough times, but can you just go over for folks who may be listening? Folks have asked me in the past, do we have more discipline issues or other unique issues with our schools of choice students? So
Yeah,
I'll let you take it away. I think I
We've
know my
studied
answer.
that for quite some time. So currently, if you think about that first year, those students, if they were accepted into kindergarten our first year, I believe they would be ninth graders, if my math is right, this year in our school district. And I used to do this work myself when I was principal at Roosevelt, and there was no data that showed that students that came from outside of our school district had a disproportionate trouble with behavior or lower academics. It really is just the fact that you have a limited window for offering this. You have already engaged families that are paying attention to our website, knowing that you have a 30-day window to apply. There are times transportation will be the one area that sometimes, as I was speaking with our pupil accountant supervisor, that sometimes families that'll be a deal breaker. They'll apply, and then they just realize transportation's pretty tough. It's pretty tough to provide on our own. So that is one area that we do see some regression in the data over time that we will, or another area that is a point of pride is we've accepted students and families into our schools of choice through a limited basis, and then that is a gateway where they want to then move to the city of Livonia, so they no longer would show as a limited schools of choice student, but rather as a resident of our school district, and they kind of drop off that data. So, but you're exactly right. But that has been one of our focus, to have them narrow the band and starting at our younger grades, because we do know we want them to be exposed to Livonia curriculum and Livonia way as early as possible in their educational experience, because it can be a little trickier if they're coming to us at older grades.
Okay. I think I had one other question. I don't know what it was now. Well, if it comes to me, I'll ask again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the details.
Mrs. Frank?
And this is just a clarification as well. When they come into our schools and they're in a triad, they will stay in that triad the entire time.
That is correct. Once, because one of the criteria for entering into our district is we've looked, and like I said, at the enrollment data and the tracking, so they stay in that triad, in that pathway.
So I'll just clarify, or add to that,
Yes.
that's absolutely true for 105 and 105C, but if a student attends Niji or Webster, because they are not technically within a triad, They have different options with regard to their middle school options and then their high school options based on the triad that they'll be moving into.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, and then Ms. Jarvis.
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. I look at it sort of from the financial end, and my recollection is last year we had 165 seats available.
185.
It was 185. Okay, so we're around 50%. So we have 165, and that gave us a certain revenue. And you indicate that we anticipate a certain revenue if all seats are filled.
is
But we
correct.
can, historically, we're like 50% of the seats available, we actually fill, right?
Yeah, we see the fill rate much higher at our lower grades. So at the K1 level, we see a much higher fill rate from families, and that has to do with a multitude of reasons. It could be that their sibling didn't get in, that they had two siblings apply at the same time, because you do not have sibling access unless you already have a sibling enrolled in 105C from a prior year.
Okay.
So, correct. But we do have a regression rate of those that apply, then those that register, and then those that actually show up. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we have the seats available, but historically, we don't, I'll say not, we don't come close to
Yeah.
filling all those seats.
Yeah, and when we research this, and there's no, it's just kind of word of mouth and talking to people, and the pupil accountants the last several years have given great information. We had 2 other applications out with other school districts. We moved to the city of Livonia. We moved to a different community, or the transportation was too much. Those are typically the reasons that they don't end up joining us.
Okay, thanks.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. I just wanted to recognize your frequent use of the word strategic, because this is a strategic program. And I see that you are wielding schools of choice like a precision tool and using it to address the needs that we currently have in terms of class size or gaps in enrollment. And you use this tool to help fill those gaps and restructure some of our classrooms to better suit our students' needs and our families' needs. And that it's important to know that you are not simply throwing open the doors to the district. This is a very controlled program, and that we assess those needs every year. So every year, we're going to look different in our school of choice program. Some years we'll have more students and more grades where we have gaps that need to be addressed. And then some years, fewer, like this, your recommendation currently is K through 4. And that's just because that's the needs that we need to address this year. The fact that it does vary year by year testifies that you do, in fact, create that program every year based on that year's needs. And I think that that speaks volumes. And I'm happy to see that. Some parents might find that inconvenient or be stressed out because it changes. Last year you had 6th grade, this year you don't. And I recognize that feeling, but because of the way you're using this precision tool, and it is strategic, that change is recognized as being a really valuable one. So I appreciate everything that you and your
thank
committee
you.
have done to wield your strategic tool.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great team effort. I'm very blessed to have a lot of voices in the room on this topic. Thanks.
Mrs. Burton.
I'm all set. It's been answered by others folks.
Okay, great. Any other questions, comments? Thank you again, Mr. Green, and we will see this on February 26th.
Thank you. See you back in a few minutes.
Okay, we're moving on to item 4B, and that's the annual education report, and Mrs. O'Brien will lead that.
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. I am happy to bring our 3rd and final accountability measure for the 23-24 school year. And this, I was telling Mrs. Acosta earlier, this is my favorite one, mostly because it gives a much broader viewpoint of our school district than the report card or the index scores. Just a little background, so annual education report is required by Michigan Department of Education. They release a certain set of things that needs to be in it each year and expectations of updates on your data and your school improvement goals. And then every school in our district has one, and then this is the district report. So there's a section of the district report that has the highlights from each of the schools' reports, so you don't have to bring every single school's report to the Board of Education. So I'd like to just walk through it a little bit with you this evening. The first page is the required cover letter that is outlined by the state of Michigan and tells us what we need to put into it. And most of this first page is all required verbiage that we have to put in. And one of the things I want to go back a minute and just say, so we call this the 23-24 annual education report because it's this school year, but it's based on 22-23 data. We used to name it by the year of the data, but then we got some feedback. You're presenting the 22-23 annual education report in February of 24. So we name it by the school year that it's in. The next page is the beginning part of each one of the schools' key initiatives and opportunities for accelerating achievement. And the paragraph before each one of those schools explains that based on our scores, a school may get identified by the state of Michigan to be a targeted support school or a comprehensive support and improvement school, and none of our schools have been given any type of a label from the Michigan Department of Education. So each school, and I asked them to update these, many of them stay pretty consistent based on their school improvement plans. And we do a in-depth school improvement plan every 3 years with a review of their goals and their data the 2 years in between. So each one of our schools has kind of shared what they're working on in order to close the gaps at their school level. And so the next several pages are all of our schools, all the way through our high schools, and then Garfield Community School and Jackson Center Early Childhood. Any questions? I know you had an opportunity to kind of look at these on what schools are working on.
Yeah.
And then following each one of our schools is just the end of that front section with a letter from our superintendent on what we're working on. So the next section is really, each section is defined by the state of Michigan, so we have to update our district profile. So the number of students that we have, the number of schools, the number of buses, and so we gather that data each year and update it, and how many employees in what types of roles that we have them working in. And then we put in our mission with our district overview, and then the next 2 pages are our shared vision and our collective commitments, which I know you know those very well. The next section is school improvement. So we put our school improvement priority areas in this section. So this section is written by us. And then our academic goals. And to just give you a little bit of background, the state of Michigan 2 years ago started to utilize a different platform for our school improvement goals. It's called MyKIP. And we have a reading, a writing, and a math goal in the MyKIP platform. We have one overall goal for all of our students in order to achieve at grade level and hitting state targets. And then we always have a measurable objective to close the gaps for our students who are not at our district average or a school average in order to close those gaps. So for reading literature and informational text, for being proficient communicators through writing, and then being proficient in mathematics. And then it's required by the state of Michigan that you have 2 years of data, and so this is the way we wrote our goals previously, which were not very in-depth. And so the 2018 through 2021 goals are listed there. A little bit of information of our district school improvement team and our QUAR process that we use, and updated that paragraph talking about our new QUAR process that we're utilizing this year in order to provide feedback on each school that's visited there. We call it holding up a mirror to what we see compared to what their school improvement plans say. The next page, 18 and 19, is just a review of our core curriculum. So it's a high-level overview of what we offer in English language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies. Those are the same ones that are listed on our website and in our parent handbooks. So then the next section is our data. And so this section, we choose what data we put in here, and it has to be at least 2 years. And so I pulled up last year's, and a lot of last year's 2021s were all saying, due to COVID, not all students took all assessments. There was asterisks all over all of our data. So I was very happy to take that off and just have the spring of 22 and the spring of 23's data on here. So our young 5s and 4-year-old preschool have a school improvement goal of identifying letters and being able to count to 20. So those are our percent of students who can do that, both in the spring of 22 and 23. We also then at kindergarten give the early literacy benchmark, so identifying all letters, letter sounds, and then rhyme, being able to rhyme. And those are our district end of the year results. We also do running records. So the Fontes and Pinnell assessment system we utilize throughout the year, but then teachers also do running records to help them instructionally. And these are our reading levels for kindergarten through 4th grade on our running records assessment. Then, as you know, we give iReady. It's one of the state-approved benchmarks. We give it at kindergarten through 8th grade. So our kindergartners take it twice a year this year, and then all of our other students take it 3 times a year. Do you want a minute to look at those? Yes.
Mrs. Burton. On the iReady, grade 5 seems to be an anomaly. Do we know what's going on?
So it's hard to judge, you know, that transition from 4th grade, and they've been in the same school for 5 years, to our 5-6. It typically has been a dip since I've been in this role. And also that beginning of, we've taken the same assessment for many years. So if you turn the page and look at our middle school scores, I hear that a lot from middle school teachers too, is that kids feel like they've taken that same assessment many times. And so they're not as invested in it. So teachers would say that that's part of the reason. But I do think, you know, this year, or last year, we got a new ELA program. We're really utilizing both the assessments within that program and iReady, and to see where those connections are, with a hope of making sure that we have that strength between the core curriculum for Tier 1 and then the diagnostic with iReady to say our kids are achieving where we want them to be. So then the next page is the middle school ELA, iReady. And then we have iReady Math for elementary and middle school. And if you recall, those math scores, our math scores are not where our ELA scores are. And particularly at middle school, last year was the first year they finished using mid-school math. So my expectation is that those 7th and 8th grade scores will continue to go up, even though 8th grade went up a teeny little bit, but they're not where we want them to be at all. Okay. But that would be our expectation with the second year of that program.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. Given what you said, Mrs. O'Brien, that it almost sounds like there's a saturation of taking these tests,
iReady.
the iReady test. it almost sounds like then these percentages may be somewhat artificial. And is there a way that we can get accurate assessments on them?
Well, I'm going to share step scores and PSAT, so there's a connection there. There is some conversation in the schools, so Frost has done a really nice job of having kids invest in this, show what you know, and sit down and have teachers help set goals with them, and their iReady scores have gone up. So spend some time helping kids see that we use those results, that they're important to us, and we want to know, instead of them just click, click, click through an online assessment. So we're trying to make sure that we are utilizing it in the best way possible, especially at those preteen 5th through 8th years.
Okay, thanks.
So then the mathematics is there. At the bottom of page 22 is our COGAT scores. COGAT is a ability test. We did not give it at 8th grade this past year, only at 6th grade, and moving forward, we're gonna keep just giving it at 6th grade. Again, that testing saturation for kids. We're looking at what would be the best one time to give that assessment. And so those verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal scores are there for our 6th and 8th graders. We utilize them for identification for some of our accelerated classes, 6th grade going into 7th, and then 8th grade going into 9th.
Mrs. Acosta.
Mrs. Frank?
Is COGAT also electronic, or is that pen and paper?
It is pen and paper, I want to say. I'm pretty sure,
Okay. Just wondering.
but I can find out for sure.
Okay.
Mrs. Acosta?
Mrs. Burton?
It is interesting because there's a great difference in the same grades, taking that test versus a different test, looking at some of those same fundamental skills.
But it's not skills, is that right?
Right.
These are more ability.
These
It's
are abilities, so these are like puzzles and problem solving. If an
Okay.
apple is to a tree, what is to a baseball? So it's those verbal, quantitative connections. There's puzzles that if the paper looks like this folded and there's a hole punched through it, which one of them is the unfolded paper?
Okay.
So it's thinking and problem solving. It's electronic? Okay. So it's electronic now.
So what I'll also say about COGAT is it is an ability score, and so generally, that is set for a student. You generally don't, if you gave that in 3rd grade, 6th grade, 9th grade, you would generally not see a significant variance, because that really is their general cognitive ability. So there may be some variance here or there, but that is why a test like that is not meant to be given on an annual basis. Where the achievement tests are the ones that the work that we do in the classroom, the interventions that we make, can have an impact on those achievement scores. Generally, ability scores are the cognitive capability that a student has.
Mrs. Frank?
Did I interrupt you? Mrs.
Nope,
Were you-
I'm done. Thank you.
But, so I guess it even shows a greater discrepancy because they have the ability, but we're just not connecting at the level of instruction or something, because clearly they have the ability to learn the material, but we're not, there is a discrepancy between the actual either instruction or the testing or something, but I think that shows a little bit that there is more ability to learn and to grow than what they're doing.
And since 2020, since COVID and online, math has been much slower for us to close the gaps for kids who had holes during that time. So kids who didn't learn as well online or didn't attend school as well when we were closed. And the math holes have been an area that across the state, math scores have not risen as quickly as our reading scores. So I hope to be sitting here next year and sharing better scores with you. I also hope in the fall, when I share our state testing scores, I'll be able to share an increase in math.
Mrs. Burton?
I don't expect that you have this information, but do we have some follow-up testing information on our students who, I mean, let me back up. I'm very proud of the fact that throughout COVID, from the school year of 20 to 21, that we offered in-person school for all of our kids, for all of our staff, and a choice of having in-person or virtual. I'm thrilled that we were able to do that, and it was not that we waved a magic wand. It was the incredible amount of work by literally hundreds of people, thousands of people, really. Do we know where our kids are testing out now with those who chose to be in person versus those who chose to be virtual? And I don't expect you to have that answer right now.
I can see if there's a way to track them, if they were in MyStar as virtual,
Okay,
and see how those students are doing.
okay. And because one thing we did learn is it's just more difficult for most, not all, for most school-age children to learn virtually as opposed to learning with their teacher and their peers in their classroom.
President Bradford?
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. I do think, I mean, I have seen the iReady diagnostic assessment, and I do think there's a lot to it as far as fatigue in taking the test goes into these scores, because it's just a difficult diagnostic, and it's online, and there's, the student has to take the time to really go through all of the questioning and everything. So if the student is not engaged, obviously they're not going to score as well. So I think there's some validity to them taking it online and having, just not spending enough time working at it, in my opinion. But that's just after, because I am a little familiar with that diagnostic. So, and if you're taking it 2 times a year, 3 times a year, it's possible that the kids are not concentrating on their efforts, just like you said.
Yep, and it adjusts based on their answers, and if you think about a middle school student,
If they're
then
in a
those
hurry.
reading pieces are a lot longer. The questions then are on the side, they're to scroll down the reading piece, and then the questions are here. And again, I feel like if we begin to make a better effort, we tell kids we're using this, we share with them the results, how important it is. We're not just doing it because we have to, right? The state has said these are the required
Right.
tests. So knowing one school is making an impact in that way, I know that she has shared with other principals how impactful that's been, and her teachers feel like kids are giving more of an effort
Yeah.
with that.
So I guess for me, the validity, right, of any assessment is it being reliable. And I think that's what we're contemplating here, that it may no longer be that valid assessment that we considered it to be for our students. So, like, in recognizing that, I guess, is iReady looking to reformulate their testing, or I'm sure we're not the only district experiencing this. So I would assume that, if they hope to continue to provide this service and for us to see it as valuable to us and our constituents, that, there's something that can be tweaked. Maybe even it's in how it's taken, that teachers can set aside, we're all doing this one, because I know those paragraphs are really tough. And it's not just the reading, but you have to be able to know how to navigate the online testing of it. So just, things that I'm throwing out, I know that I'm sure teachers, when they're looking at this, are also wishing that it was better, that it was a better reflection of their hard work in the classroom, so.
So to clarify, this is year end to year end. This is not showing growth of the students from fall until the end of the year.
Yep.
So this is
Spring of '22.
indicating the students that were at mid or above grade level. So they may have grown a grade level in that year, but they would not be reflected on this if they were early at that grade level
Correct.
at the end of the year, correct? So if they're a 6th grader and they maybe started the year at a beginning 5th grade level and ended the year at a beginning 6th grade level, that growth would not be reflected in this. This is only
No, this is
reflecting
proficiency.
students who are proficient at mid or above grade level.
Correct. By the time you reach the end of the year, early of that grade level is considered below grade level. So by the time you get to June, early sixth grade is considered below grade level at the end of sixth grade. If on the mid-year assessment,
Regardless of where they started.
correct. If on the mid-year, early of that grade would be seen as on grade level. But by the end of the year, if they're only at early, then they're behind.
So I know that if I pulled up an individual student, I could see like the red, yellow, green.
Yes.
Is it possible to have the report then reflect, not by student, but
Sure.
am I explaining myself? So that we can see.
You'd like to see the bar.
That breakdown of
Sure.
their, you know, kind of to Mrs. Oqua's point.
Yep. Okay. Our last section of assessments is our state assessments. And so last year, we started as a part of our school improvement process is tracking all of the PSAT assessments that we take. So we take PSAT is our state-required 8th grade assessment, and then we take SAT at 11th grade. And so we decided to start tracking PSAT 9 and PSAT 10 because we take them, and so why not look at that growth? And so we have the last 2 years of PSAT 8, 9, 10, and SAT evidence-based reading and writing, so that's the ELA portion of SAT. And then mathematics, the SAT math compared to the PSAT 8, 9, and 10.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Mrs. O'Brien, when we're looking at these scores and we're seeing spring of '23 and spring of '22, we're comparing two different cohorts of students, correct?
Correct.
We are not, this is two separate sets of kids that we're comparing at their level.
Correct.
Okay. And I think, you know, as with a lot of statistics and scores and stuff, I think these are great tools for us to use to be able to look at how we're doing, use them as goalposts or, you know, where we might be able to improve. But again, you know, we talk about the validity of the test and the kids, and are we comparing cohorts or are we comparing kids at grade level? That these are really tools in our toolbox and not a true, I guess, reflection of an overall indicator of how we're doing as a district. I think, again, we're looking at different things, looking at different kids, looking at different different tests, and we can extrapolate some of that stuff from it. But I think, you know, using these things as a tool to help us to improve is very, very important. But necessarily looking at some of these scores and making an overall judgment call of how we're doing as a district is probably a little extreme. That, you know, that we need to use these statistics for what they're meant for.
When you look at these 4 grade levels over 2 years, yes, it's not the same kids, but it does tell you how we're doing. PSAT 8 is our 8th grade state assessment, and then how we're doing SAT. We had that gap in those years where we weren't reporting the other 2, so it just made us ask the question, why wouldn't we be reporting on the 9 and the 10 so that we can see how we are doing preparing students from 8th to 11th for that SAT assessment. So that was one of the reasons why we're now tracking those 4.
Mrs. Burton?
Some of the, I mean, throughout this entire report, some of these scores are terrific. Some of them are not where we would like for them to be. But one thing I'm seeing is overall, we're still seeing improvement in these scores, which I'm happy to see. Even if it's one step this year, one step next year, et cetera, the vast majority are going in an upward direction. So
Correct.
that's encouraging to see.
Yes, it is. So the next section is just a review of homeschool partnerships. So each one of the schools has to report their percent and the number of parents that attend parent-teacher conferences. It's one of the requirements from the state of Michigan for 2 years' worth of conferences, and so then we add that all together and have a district average. Some information about our PTSA and how many people are involved in that, and some of our PTA events on the next page, like Reflections and Youth Making a Difference. You also have to report any specialized programming you offer in your school district in our annual education report. So we write a paragraph explaining our NEGIRO and our ACAP program. We also talk about our special education center programs and our GSRP, our MACAP program at middle school, and then at our high school, our wide variety of CTE, and then MSc and CAPA programs. You need to state each year what schools are Title I. That's a requirement also, so that's listed there. And then it ends with linking your parent involvement policy to your annual education report, so ours is there. And then the last section, and we put this at the beginning and the end for families who may not read all the way to the end, what data is required by the state of Michigan, just so our parents know. So we do report this in that first letter, just so that parents have that information. And then at the end of every school and ours is a link that takes you directly to my school data for you to look at any of the data, points of data that are in the state of Michigan's database.
Mrs. O'Brien, I have a quick question. If we go back to the homeschool partnership,
Sure.
at the secondary level where it's showing 33% of parents attended, does this take into consideration that there are a certain number of slots for parents to participate in parent-teacher conferences?
I'm sure that is why it's reported that way.
Okay.
And I did not write it any differently since we've done it virtually now. So that would be
I
a
would
great
think
thing
we'd
in
be
the
closer
future
to like
for me
100%
to
filling all
write
the slots
differently.
available.
Thank you.
Maybe not
see
100,
what
but
you
a
mean.
higher percentage of parents. Mrs. Burton.
That same section got my attention. I am thrilled and very proud that we have 95 and 96% of our parents of our elementary school kiddos attending conferences, because that homeschool connection is so important. I'm disappointed at the dramatic drop-off at secondary, and I'm wondering what we can do as a district to encourage that to happen. I know one of the reasons it happens is because we have electronic access to our students' grades and teachers and so forth, but there still is so much to be gained by sitting down and spending even just a few minutes across a desk from your students' teachers. I mean, I know with my own kids, you know, it gives you conversation you can have with your own kids in so many different areas. When you actually know you're talking about and with the person that you now know is the same person, and how they're delivering instruction and what your kids are getting out of those classes. All that to say, what can we do as a district to encourage more parents to attend secondary conferences? I still believe they're important if you can find the numerical result of every single assignment and every single test your kid ever took. That's not what conferences are most importantly, I believe, about. It's more of getting that whole picture, and that's hard to put onto a number. But I know we've gone through a lot over the last few years, and of course, there's the COVID factor. And I know that there's just the difficulty in flow of parents and so forth, and getting enough people in and out of the building, and all that acknowledged. What can we do as a district to encourage more secondary parents to attend parent-teacher conferences?
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to address some thoughts about that. I think there's one significant difference between elementary and secondary that we have not talked about, and that is at the elementary, a teacher has somewhere between 22 and 28 students, and we do ask them to reach every parent. So we ask them to follow up on each one of those children, because that is the teacher who is with them all day long. And so there's generally one teacher, one student, sometimes a second teacher, but as far as required for a conference, it's one teacher, one student. And so initially, most teachers, most parents sign up for those, but if they don't, then we do ask that they follow up and have either a phone conference or an in-person conference. So it is a little easier to track down that group of sets of parents of 24 students rather than 150.
Acknowledged.
That is one
Absolutely, you're
piece
right.
of it. With the secondary, a couple of things that Mr. Etu and his team have done is really to garner feedback from parents on their preference for virtual or in-person. And we saw a pretty even split at the secondary. And so in the fall, parents have the option to either come into the school and have an in-person conference, and we've made those a little easier to plan for. Previously, parents have had to wait in long lines, not knowing if they would be able to see 6 teachers or not in the time that they had allocated. They were a little less private. Now teachers are in their classrooms, and they are scheduled in those increments. And then parents can put a buffer of 5 minutes or so to get from one classroom to another, but they know within a 45-minute period or so, they can get to each one of their teachers and sign up for an in-person slot or a virtual slot. And so whatever works best for the parent, they can do that. And so that is something that was offered this fall, both in person and virtual, but they were able to schedule for both. Am I saying that correctly?
You're saying
Yes.
correctly, and a lot of parents actually chose both.
Okay.
When they were there on day one for in-person, they signed up for some virtual sections as well the next day.
Yeah, so I think we're hoping that that's helpful. In the spring, they will be it will be one session because generally spring is a little lighter. And I think you're absolutely right. You've identified a big one, which is on Parent Connect, so much information is available. But your question was, what can we do? So one thing was to survey parents and to ask which they would prefer. The other piece of feedback that they gave us was that it was difficult to be uncertain in 2 hours if they were even going to get to all of their teachers. So the ability to schedule, even if it's in person, as well as virtual, we're hoping will be helpful to get more in. And then in the spring, I believe Mrs. Frank and I think a couple folks mentioned that they had asked us to pass along the request that when schools put out information about spring conferences, that all parents are welcome and encouraged to attend conferences. I think there was, in the desire to try to accommodate parents of students who are struggling, it was leaving some parents feeling like the messaging was, if your student is successful, don't attend a conference. And that is certainly not the message we want to give. And so I shared that feedback with Mr. Etu, and I know he has shared that with principals as well, that spring conferences are for parents of any student. And so those will be coming up in just a few short weeks, if you can believe it. And so that information will go out to families. And so we did hear that from you last year, and that will be incorporated. And also, there is information that if you cannot get into a slot, that a teacher will contact you at a different time. So we want to make sure that at any time, whether it's conferences or another time of year, if a parent is seeking that opportunity to meet with their child's teacher, we will certainly make that available. So those are a few of the ways, is to get feedback through surveys from the parents as well as from our staff as far as what has worked, to have the more private setting rather than the large group setting, we're hoping is helpful. And then again, the messaging about spring conferences. So those are a few that I can think of that Mr. Etu and his team have instituted based on some of the conversation we've had here. But I know some of you are parents of secondary students, so we would be open to any other thoughts you might have.
And just a quick question. Mrs. O'Brien, this is maybe more toward you. When it says at the secondary level, 33.66%, of parents attended, is that attended any conference or attended all 6? Because frequently it's any conference. Okay, we're hearing from Mr. Etu in the back of the room that it's attending any conference.
So we're not taking all the students times 6 and then dividing that by the number?
When parents signed up, they got counted as attending conferences.
Okay, whether they attended a few of their teachers or all the kids' teachers, okay. Okay, which is how I hope it would be, because
Yeah.
sometimes in reality, you might do well to get 4 out
Right.
of the 6, but
Right.
still, I sure hope that counts.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And,
okay.
Along those lines, I wanted to add, there was a glitch, and I was panicking because I couldn't get on, and the teachers did a great job of communicating, sending me a new link to log on, and there was one teacher, I think was one of the first ones, ended up messaging me and said, if you can come in person, I'm still available till this time, so I actually went in person to meet with her. So, they were definitely very accommodating. The fact that there was those 2 options made it easier to make sure that I hit every teacher, so I appreciate that.
I love having the 2 options. I think that's absolutely fair, because for any given parent, one is probably much more preferable than the other. So I love that we're trying to be accommodating for folks.
Yeah, and sometimes it worked for people to do it from work. and to
Absolutely.
just
They
hop
couldn't
on
take the day off work,
Right,
or
a
they
virtual
could.
conference,
yeah.
or maybe couldn't do it that evening, so
Yep.
hopefully helpful to have both.
Mrs. Frank?
And one benefit is if you have a spouse or a significant other, they can also, sorry. It is great that you can be in 2 different locations, 3 different locations. The teacher, the 2 parents are in 2 different locations, and you can all have the same conference. And I think the other thing is, I think the district has made great strides in terms of the first time we did the online conferencing and the glitches that came with it, and the movement that we've made to now, to be able to just click through and just go to the next conference and go to the next conference. I would be interested to hear how many are full, and you can't get in. How many teachers are because I think that there is still, that some teachers are totally booked for maybe one day or the other day. I'm not sure, but I do know last year that there were some that were just totally booked and I couldn't get in. And I think some teachers block some different times. Anyway, I'd be interested to find out that data. If there are a lot of teachers that are fully booked, or if there's plenty of room. But I agree. I think we didn't get into a couple teachers, and they had great feedback via email, or do you want to do a conference call or email? And so I think it's great, but I think it just brings it to top of mind. When conferences come out, it's like, I do need to connect with my kids' teachers, because I agree with Mrs. Burton. All the letters are there and all the grades are there, but I think what we're looking for is a less tangible, right? That homeschool partnership is not just about the grades. It's really about, what's my child doing in the classroom? Tell me about his behavior. Tell me about her behavior. Tell me about the learning type she is, because we want to learn as we help our kids navigate through school. We want to learn what feedback they're exhibiting in school, and so I think it's really great. And I'm excited for that messaging that everybody is welcome, because I think that makes such a difference to it. So I'm thankful that we're doing both, and I think it's really grown, that the whole process has really grown into something that's really effective. So
Great, and we'll get you some information on whether or not there are teachers who are full, and what happens, what messaging we give out when that does happen.
yeah, perfect. Thank you.
And that was that piece that I thought this 33% might not capture. At least, when I log on, I see a lot of slots full, so I'd be surprised, or maybe they're not showing up after they've, reserved the slot. I'm not sure. So. Mrs. Bonifield?
On a different subject, I know that with the having free breakfast and lunch for all the kids could potentially have an impact on our Title I funding. And this might not be the appropriate time, and we can talk about it later, but I am curious to see what the impact of the all students receive the free breakfast and lunch has had on our Title I.
It's important.
I think we can answer that.
Yeah, it started this year. We saw an impact on it from the COVID years, so it went down. I think our Title I principals are working really hard to make sure, all our principals are working very hard to make sure parents fill out that paperwork. It's part of our, beginning of the year paperwork, so that we have that. Our percent has crept up a little bit since 2020. And some of our schools have fluctuated. So we're very interested to continue to track that, so that we know what that connection is, and that all parents who would need that support if it wasn't free, know that that paperwork helps us provide that support. And so it's a very strong communication piece.
Yeah, and I think we're actually up over last year, aren't we?
our percent overall as a district?
Yes.
Yes, slightly, yeah.
And so that tells us that people are filling out the paperwork because they would have had to fill it out last year since we weren't, that wasn't a benefit that was provided. I will say that I think Mrs. Jenkins, in conjunction with working with our elementary and secondary departments and principals, really did an outstanding job in our opening letters as well as our LPS link this fall to illustrate for parents very clearly what the benefits are of filling out that paperwork. That it is beyond simply garnering the free and reduced status for breakfast and lunch, but even within the district with regard to pay to participate fees are significantly different. Throughout the community, there are a number of different opportunities and benefits. And so we actually were, and I think a lot of that was because of the messaging put out by our district, by our communications department, and by our schools, that was something that was very, very clearly communicated many times. And I think we have seen a strong response to that, where folks have an auxiliary reason to fill that out and see benefit from that. But because we were concerned about the same.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so I'm assuming none of our all 100%, I don't know what you call it, the all-school Title I, we didn't lose any all-school Title I.
School-wide, no,
Yeah, school, okay.
no.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you,
thank
Mrs.
you for letting
O'Brien.
me share our annual education report, and it will be posted on our district website by the end of this week.
Thank you.
Yes, it is. This is important, right? This is why we do what we do. I feel like what's the state of our district, right? These are really, really important things to look at. So thank you for bringing it all together. I'm sure you do it every year, but it is really vital information for all of us to see and for our communities. So thank you for the transparency. My pleasure.
Thank you. Moving on to item 4C, registration dates 2024-2025, pre-K, kindergarten, SAC, summer SAC. Mr. Green, take it away.
Good evening again.
Hello there. Good evening.
So this part will be one I'll have to contain my excitement about. Let's first start, as you know, that monthly at our public study sessions, usually Mr. Francis and myself have been updating the board on our progress at our early childhood center, involving all sorts of different aspects of what that programming is going to look like there, from the construction and everything else. And I'm so appreciative of our community for their support in our most recent bond package to support the building of this early childhood center. If you had a chance to see the LPS link that was sent out last week, LPS link number 8 to be exact, from our wonderful communications department, there was a great description of the early childhood center, where they're at in the process, some great renderings. So it's just all very exciting. And I look forward to, as the rest of the school year progresses, giving the board continued updates at our study session and, as applicable, updates at the committee of the whole meetings. So if tonight is not a voting item, it's just the purpose is really to get everybody excited about next year already. We've talked about intra-district transfers earlier this evening and schools of choice, and registration is coming up. As you know, historically in our school district, and we spent a lot of time last week again on these registration dates, but as you can recall, historically we have started a lot of our registration at kindergarten, specifically on February 1st. We have moved that registration date to match many of our other registration dates for the upcoming school year to March 1st. And if you think about going backwards to last week, I announced with you, and we've talked about this for months, the different programming that will be at our early childhood center, from fee-based preschool to childcare to early on, early special education programming, Great Start Readiness, and other special education and other services for our youngest learners. So it's going to be a comprehensive early childhood center. And you will start seeing in the next week or so all those various dates posted on our website. Our website is going to have a new look coming up soon, and it's going to have a great new pizzazz to it. And so we're timing all of that with our registration dates for next year. And again, very grateful to Stacy and Emily in our communications department, because they're doing a lot of heavy lifting on that to get that conversion ready. But we thought it was a perfect time of year to get that website up and running, so our registration information for next year will be there for our families. And I appreciate our families' patience as we make this conversion. But as you heard last week, one of the big registration deadlines that our community is always interested in at this time of year is our SAC program. And so just as a reminder, you don't have to take notes in the viewing public because these are going to be on our website, but March 5th, our summer SAC for this summer will open up. March 12th, our registration for returning SAC families will open up. March 19th, for returning families. March 20th for LPS employees, we'll be opening up our SAC for next year, and March 21st for new SAC families. So we've followed this process of returning families, and then we have a delay of a day or so, and then we have LPS employees eligible to register, and then for the following new families for our SAC program. So currently, we're looking at our SAC locations for next year, and that will be advertised on our website as well. So that's a very exciting time, and I started with Summer SAC, which is for this current school year, which will be housed at Riley Upper Elementary School. As we continue to think about these dates for next year, we look at our child care offerings at our Early Childhood Center, and for those, March 12th, registration will begin for child care. March 14th, registration for LPS employees seeking child care, and March 15th for new families requesting child care. And on our website, you will see all the various ages and opportunities for child care at our Early Childhood Center. So that is our SAC and child care offerings that are soon to be announced. If you think about our Great Start Readiness program that will be heading to our Early Childhood Center, registration will begin on March 1st. And as I explained to you, placement for Great Start Readiness isn't official until July because we have to wait on the governor signing off on the various bills as related to GSRP. And then placement for those families is usually notification in July. So that's been the historic trend, and we'll keep an eye on that if there's any changes at the state level on that and update the community as needed. When we think about our wonderful historical fee-based preschool options in our school district, and many of us have had our own children in those programs over the years, we have those opening up March 5th, registration for returning preschool families. We'll have a variety of options for families from Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday, half days, to Monday through Friday, full days, and we'll be able to offer some elements of childcare tagged onto that at the Early Childhood Center. So, that's really matching a lot of the shifts we've seen recommended from the state that we're really focusing on preschool at earlier ages, but still recognize that there's a childcare aspect to some of our preschool offerings. So that's coming up soon. And then really the big shift that we spent some time last week talking about is going to be the evolution of our Young Fives programming. And I really appreciated, we had a debrief after last Monday talking about your feedback. And our Young Fives programming next year will be full day programming. This is going to match what we see across the state of Michigan. And so right now behind the scenes, there's a lot of work going into that. And that registration for Young Fives will take place starting in March. That's not the end of the game, though. As we spoke last week, we're going to have information nights at all of our schools on April 9th when we have our traditional kindergarten information night. So we'll talk to our families at all of our sites that night about making sure they're making an informed choice for their youngest learner entering our K-12 continuum. And they'll get to know about our current kindergarten program, and they'll also get to know that there's a Young Fives option that's age band. It's an age band, July 1 to December 1, and they'll see that option on the table. And again, I hate to keep saying go to the website because it's more than go to the website, but on our website, we're going to have a great FAQ document, and we're going to really spend a lot of time this spring educating our families about making a great choice for their children, whether it's Young Fives or whether it's traditional kindergarten, and what does that mean for their progression. So that's a work in progress as we continue to develop this, but we are excited. We have a lot of benefit to this. I met with the Young Fives staff at Jackson last week. What a tremendous staff, giving me some of their historical perspective, and they're very excited. They had some great questions, and one of the things they said, that just to continue to remind everybody that's working on this work, and their voice is going to be with us along the journey, is to educate our families. They're going to need to know what's the right choice for my child. So just so many amazing offerings. So if you think about it again, we're going to have SAC, childcare, preschool, GSRP, kindergarten, young fives. We're launching all these registration dates in March. So that's going to be exciting as we're living in this current year, but preparing for next year. And so that's a big picture update with a lot of great news.
Thank you. President Bradford.
Mrs. Acosta, thank you. Wow, that's awesome. It's a lot of work. So trying to coordinate all that, I can imagine you guys are extremely busy trying to get that all coordinated. I'm really excited to see that we have a new we're going to have a new website that will hopefully be clearly outline all those dates and everything for people. So the more we can get the information out, the better. Will there be anything on Facebook, do we know, or on some of these other websites?
Yes.
Okay, so we should be stay tuned for that on our different sites, so we'll be seeing some of that. Okay, wonderful. Thanks for all you do. It's unbelievable that we're planning for the opening of the ECC this fall. I mean, it's just such exciting news and something that I know we've all just been waiting for. So to know that we're actually registering for that now is just, it's coming along great. So we're excited about that. So thanks.
Mrs. Burton. Mr. Green, I'm not sure if this is a question really for you or maybe perhaps for Mrs. Sproul. Some of our programs, such as Early On and Talk It Up, are geared for very young learners. How do our parents of our youngest little members of our community find out if that service would benefit their young child? Because some of these programs are really starting at 18 months, if I understand correctly.
Even younger.
Okay, and even younger. I'm not here. So how do our parents in our community know about those programs, and how do they go about accessing them? Say they have a little one that they have some concerns at a year, 2 years old. Where do they go and what do they do in order to have us help them on their journey?
That's a great question, because early intervention is just so important to help our littlest learners get a head start at that school career that we're looking forward to helping them with. Currently, our Jackson Early Childhood Center supports early on programming for our Livonia Public Schools families, which is an intervention for just our littlest learners, so our 0 to 3-year-olds. They don't have to have an identified special education need. It's just that connection to our 0 to 3 families where we can provide support and coaching to our families to help students receive more and more services in their homes, so directly from parents who are the first teachers. As students get to age 2.5, we start to provide special education services to students that much of the time starts at the Jackson Early Childhood Center. So if a family is concerned about their students' needs, the first step would be to call up Jackson Early Childhood Center, and they could talk with a special education provider. We would then invite that family with their little one to come in, and we would do first a screening, and then if it warranted it, a full evaluation to determine if that student needs something a little extra. Many times, though, we're finding that giving little tips and tricks to help families, if it's a speech sound, for example, producing those sounds, we can do a lot with home programs and things like that. But I think really the key is just making the connection to the staff at the Jackson Early Childhood Center and soon to be our new facility so that we can help make that connection for school.
Do pediatricians refer? So for the early on, because it's generally infants and young children, and our staff is generally going out to the home for that service. So do those referrals come, I know some of our staff have said from one family to another.
Yeah.
They may read about it in our dialogue, but do we also have pediatricians, for instance, that may refer?
Absolutely. So our referrals come from all over. Many times it's from families who connect to their neighbor with, hey, my little one received services from Jackson. Why don't you go check that out too? We educate our area pediatricians and other community members just about the resources that are available through Jackson. So it's really about, we want to find children who are at risk, so that Child Find initiative is really big for our little guys. So we're always out there looking for how we can make that connection and support our learners.
And that number that we're servicing has grown significantly, because we just took over early on 2 years ago. It was housed in Wayne Westland for this area of the county, and then they asked Livonia to take on that program, and now we have significantly more students that
Yeah.
we're servicing.
And I am absolutely thrilled by that, because then we get to keep our little learners here in our district, and we get to provide them with more and more resources. If we're encouraging a preschool or a play group or library time, you really want to know about the library time happening right here in Livonia, so that it's accessible to our families and our students. So I think that's been just a huge a gain for our families, and also for our staff, who get to know families younger and younger.
Mrs. Byrne. The early on program, I can't speak highly enough of. Some beloved little preemies that I know who are near and dear to my heart, but don't live in our community, live in a different community in Michigan, benefited greatly from it. I believe it was their physician who turned them on to it, but it is a service that they received in their home through their public school system over on another side of the state. But it was absolutely phenomenal. But it was designed, in case anybody who's listening is not aware, it's designed just to, not because they had an identifiable need at that point, but because they were preemies, they were trying to catch them up so that by the time they were 2, they were on par with their gestational aged peers, which they did. I mean, they did it. But it's terrific. It's not just cognitive, but it's physical needs. It's, are they rolling over on time? Are they starting to crawl on time? Are they babbling on time? All those types of milestones that started, I believe, at like 3 months old. So for anybody who knows little ones who may be preemies or may have any other thing that didn't go exactly like clockwork, do reach out to Jackson Center and find out what services are available. It is absolutely phenomenal. I was unsure of what it all was, and I learned pretty quickly, and I was so very, very impressed. But to know that we offer that in LPS, I just couldn't be happier. It benefits our kiddos, our parents. It was a benefit to the parents, who then could learn how to help their little one develop more quickly, and got reassurance when everything was okay too. So it was a good thing all the way around. The Talk It Up program, can you mention that briefly for some folks who may not be familiar with it?
The Talk It Up program is an articulation program for our students who are learning about speech sound production sounds, and it's more than just 1 or 2 sounds. So if you have a child that, for example, isn't saying their K sound appropriately, instead of being a car, it becomes a tar every time they're talking about it. We see patterns of speech disorders like that, and in our little learners, that's really impactful as they're listening to stories and repeating their parent or their neighbors. So we have a program that is designed where students come in 1 to 2 times a week, and they work directly with a speech-language pathologist who helps them to formulate those sounds and really get a head start on those speech sound production. We're looking at ways that we can provide that service when kids are little, so that we can remediate that hopefully before kindergarten, certainly before 1st or 2nd grade in the vast majority of cases. So that really helps our students be in the classroom the majority of the day, rather than having to leave the class to receive an additional service. So the little ones, there can be groups of up to 12 students with that speech pathologist. Generally, we have 2 staff members in there as well. As you know, little ones are busy. So it's really a targeted speech sound production program.
Great. And all of these programs that we've been discussing tonight are free for parents to utilize.
Absolutely, yes. It's a free program. We offer home program components as well, so that you can practice those skills in the home environment, which is where all of our communicating and talking happens. So the more you can do it at home, the better off, and the more it's going to generalize. And all of those services are provided free to our LPS families.
That's great. Okay, Thank you so
What will
much.
be nice also is, besides social media, besides the website, in our new Early Childhood Center, our main office is called a Welcome Center. So if you think about what does that
Love that.
look like in action, we're hoping that a mom or a dad who has a concern come right into our main entrance, ask some questions like that, and then we have just a multitude of support staff there that can help guide them to what are those best choices for their young one. Because we vision this as the starting point and the long journey with Livonia Public Schools. And so whatever we can do to steer them in the right direction, that's why it's called the Welcome Center. You're welcome to come here. We have the staff that can answer a lot of your concerns as a parent because it's personal. When you have a little one at home and you want to get help right away, so.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I, in my opinion, we can't advertise this enough, all those young, so often you think of school, you think that starting is at kindergarten or very close to it, but to know that we have services that you can offer starting your 3-month-old all the way on up. It's important to get that message out as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
Super beneficial. So thank you for all the work that you both put into keeping all those programs thriving and bringing more of them into LPS. I think it's fabulous.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
And that concludes the curriculum committee report.
Great job, Mrs. Acosta. Okay, we're going to move on. If that wasn't wonderful, we're moving on to item 5, Building and Site Committee, and I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Burton.
Thank you very much. First item on our building and site is our quarterly dashboard, and we're going to hear from Mr. Francis and Mr. Weber, I believe. You sat through a lot of other stuff in order to get to this, so thank you.
Good evening,
Good
everyone.
evening.
Thanks for having me.
I think Mr. Weber already passed out a couple of items
Yes.
for you. So the first thing we're going to tackle is the quarterly dashboard. This is for fourth quarter of 2023. And I think we'll just kind of kick it off and get rolling with it. We do have it for the folks who are watching at home, as well as if you just rather look up at the screen, that's available to you.
Well, thank you. As a reminder to everybody, this is our quarterly report, just summarizing the bond program to keep the community updated. Our goal is to stay very transparent of how this bond program is running, including updates on progress and the financials. So we report this quarterly and can answer questions as we go. So feel free to chime in where needed. I'll start on the left-hand side of the document, starting with the bond program goals and objectives. I won't hit every item on here, but these are the overarching initiatives from the bond program that we're maintaining and focusing on as we continue to design and move through the phases of the program. Moving down into critical items, zooming in a little bit on what we're working through from project to project. We're still continuing to monitor the ongoing construction cost escalation and supply chain issues. The market is still robust for construction in Southeast Michigan, so working with our team, we're making sure we're hitting bid timelines, procuring materials appropriate, so that's something that stays on the forefront of how we're planning each phase. Moving into resolve any remaining classroom air conditioning issues. So as you're aware, there were issues with some of the classroom air conditioning systems. There have been crews in the buildings off hours at night, also over holiday break, a lot was accomplished. So we are preparing for next season to make sure that we are mitigating any potential issues, but also the team is ready and available if any other issues arise. They will be on site and available to address as they come up. Maintaining the construction schedule for the Early Childhood Center. So as previously mentioned a little bit, the project is progressing well. The goal is we're opening that up in the fall. So as you drive by Newburgh, you'll see quite a different structure out there now. It's pretty prominent and a lot of good work's going on out there. So we're obviously keeping an eye on that one. And then lastly, touching on a little bit, procuring vlog lead equipment and materials for this upcoming summer's work. Clark Construction, French architects are working with us in weekly meetings to make sure that we're planning ahead, getting crews available, getting materials ordered in preparation for the start of that work. Any other questions for critical items? All right, and then high level, just touching on program phasing, there is quite a bit going on between the years and each of the bid packages. So we are looking to close out the renovations from 22-23. That will involve some more testing in the commissioning process for startup, just to vet out and verify systems are working. That'll take place in the spring, rolling into the summer and get those jobs closed out.
And just to clarify why it's in spring, again, we've talked probably in the past about this, but we need for them to do testing on air conditioning. It needs to be a certain temperature fairly consistently as well. It can't just be like, it was 60 the other day, which was crazy in February, but having a one-day one-off isn't enough. We need to have some consistency in that minimum temperature.
Okay. Moving into the Early Childhood Center as well, obviously that's in the construction phase and progressing well on site. Phase 2B would be the doors and hardware upgrades. So since the last time I gave this update, there was a package was brought forth to pull ahead some of the safety and security items in some of the schools are doing in later years. It was able to become an efficient package for the construction manager. We could able to do it off the summer season of construction, so it was kind of a win-win for the district and the construction manager to work efficiently. But since the last time we were here, Niji Eero had doors, frames, and hardware added to some classrooms. That was completed successfully over the holiday break. And then we just received some additional parts, hardware and doors and pieces for other schools that is being scheduled and will be happening off hours at other schools throughout the district that we're working with Mr. Lau and his team to make sure that we're getting into facilities and working obviously off hours and not disturbing any processes. The Phase 3, 2024 renovations, we're currently in the planning and procurement phase, meeting with multiple committees and teams in the district now, talking to principals, making sure everybody's on board of schedules, what's coming their way, working through logistics and understanding the impact that will be at their school this year. They're the ones that will, we've had a couple iterations of it, but making sure we're communicating with those teams as well. And then, whether you believe it or not, we have started the design process for the 2025 projects as well. So we've already been in contact with those schools. Initial concept drawings are put together right now. So that process is already started with the goal of putting a package out in the fall for bidding that work as well.
Questions or comments on this section? Alrighty.
All righty, we'll move over to the cost summary and the cash flow finances. And I promise I won't go through every value here, but we'll touch where we need to. So going through categories, brief explanation. Current budget, self-explanatory. That's how many dollars are in each one of the categories working down the sheet. Current contracts and purchase orders. These are any contracts that have been signed or purchase orders that have been signed in a commitment to the bond. So we're anticipating those costs. Column C would be the actuals paid against those contracts and purchase orders. Column D was just math of what the contract value is minus what has been paid, how much of that money remains is column D. Column E is a forecasted contract or purchase order, so not yet under contract, but we anticipate those costs coming as we develop future bid packages, so we forecast those costs out. Column F would be an unallocated reserve. That is an owner contingency that it's non-committed, but available funds as reserve as any instances come up or adjusting as needed as we continue to work through the program. And then our last column just showing that we are forecasted to spend all dollars on the bond. There are measures in place that we're not over under right now, but working with Ms. Smith and her team and leadership to make sure that we are tracking costs that are being spent. One couple items I do want to highlight here. The bottom of column A, the current budget. So the initial bond program was $186 million. This is also tracking $3.4 million in earned interest. So that is money that was in the account gaining interest while sitting in the account. We track those dollars. Those are actual dollars in hand, nothing that is forecasted, so we are conservative on those dollars that are being tracked. And then one other factoid for you. Column C at the bottom at $95 million. Last time I was here, it was about $83 million, so there's about $12 million of, majority of that is construction work put in place with some of the professional fees and everything, so we are moving at a good pace right now. And then wrapping up the cash flow finances, this is just a summary of dollars that are in the essential bank account, what's been spent to date, just tracking to make sure that funds are available. And as you can see, there's about $56 million still sitting in there that is being used to pay the monthly invoices and pay applications to the contractors.
All right.
Any questions?
Questions or comments? No.
It's a really succinct way to,
Go ahead.
it's a really succinct way to talk about a lot of things that are going on.
It is,
I mean,
yes.
This represents so many things that are going on in so many of our buildings, and it's a way to look at it in a way that makes it easy to understand, but it's still a lot of pieces go into each number that's here and
It
each
is.
number that's represented, and a lot of moving targets and moving pieces that are
Yep.
going on, so.
It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of balls in the air, and we have a lot of help with that. And you know, Brian's just amongst one of many in a team, but he does an amazing job keeping, you know, keeping our district, like, representing us at times when perhaps I can't be there or for something, or just bringing our team together and giving recommendations. But of course, as the district, we have those final says in these items. If you look at program phasing, just about all of those things are happening simultaneously right now, right? I mean, I had a meeting this morning with folks, you know, from one of our elementary schools that would be for 2025. And we had, you know, the architect on that call. We were talking through some, you know, very early schematic design. And at the same time,
Last Friday, I think
yeah,
we were doing
we were
summer
going through-
2024 library.
Yep, we were looking at the different furniture pieces of that. We were at the ECC today, talking with Clark Construction on, you know, walking that building and talking through the finish. It's all of these pieces that are just simultaneously happening, and that's important. Otherwise, we would be in a, you know, 12-year bond run of trying to get things done if we took them all one at a time. So it takes a very large and a responsible team, and I just want to, you know, say thank you to all of them and everybody that's involved with that, including, you know, Mrs. Oquist, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Green, Mr. E2, everybody, Mrs. Sproul. We all have to get together and talk about these things and dip our toes in that water.
Absolutely. Mrs. Bradford?
Yeah, I echo that. I just want to thank you for always bringing this report, Brian, because this really gives us an overview, and we know how much work is going into this and the moving parts, like Mrs. Frank said. So this is a great piece, and we do kind of laugh about it when we get it, but we're so happy to get it because it just gives us a lot of information. So
Well,
and
thank you for
we know
that
that things
feedback.
are moving along and the team is working hard, so appreciate it.
I think it's an important piece of transparency for our taxpayers as well. So this is something that, going back to literally the 2013 bond, Plant Moran Crest, our partners in this, and Livonia Public Schools has put this out and published it and put it on our website quarterly every year since 2013. So through the entire first bond and now through beginning with this bond, this quarterly dashboard is put up right after it's shared with the board. And it continues to be an important element of transparency for our taxpayers because, as you know, we do these above and beyond pieces, whether that's to have a separate accounting firm handling our bond audits or having these quarterly dashboard reports that we present to the board, that we first internally review, we present to the board, and then we share it with our public. So this is something that no matter where we are in the process, folks can go back and take a look at the expenditures throughout the process thus far and follow it all the way through to completion. And I think this is really an important element of that transparency for our community who so strongly supported the bond.
For sure.
Other comments, questions, Mrs. Frank?
I'm sorry if I missed it, and I heard a little bit, you talked about air conditioning. Do we have a whole team that's ready as air conditioning pops back on to make sure that we are up and running with our air conditioning that is ready to, in case there are any more glitches or that sort of thing with the schools that have been online? Are we sure that?
We've actually been working on them, not in the startups of them, but there's been other pieces of work that have been going on from an engineering standpoint with regard to work that's been happening over the winter in certain areas, as well as just turning down the speed of the fans in certain spaces. So work has been ongoing. The meetings on it have been ongoing. And I think we're set up with that team once the weather sort of clicks over, which could be any day. We never know, even though it's February. But really, we're thinking more along the lines of when spring in earnest comes.
So what will that look like, Mr. Weber, as far as checking in on those places that maybe still had some problems when it got cold?
Yep.
And as we get warm, what is the process for that?
So we've been meeting as a construction team along with Mr. Lau and his team, with his staff for the facilities and maintenance. The process we're working through now is get the work done that we can be proactive on in preparation for those warmer temperatures. And we will actually, through the controls of the programs, when more convenient, we're going to try and force those units to run rather than when they have to run. We can push it above and beyond a little bit when the temperatures normally wouldn't call for air conditioning, but is safe for those to run. We're going to be proactive in starting those processes. That will be part of the construction team with Clark Construction, with the HVAC contractors, along with Mr. Lau and his team, understanding. And there's ways, the control system can monitor their district. It's a pretty cool program with graphics of each school, which rooms are hitting temperatures or different colors. So we have an interactive model that we can use as a guidepost of, hey, we turn this building on, there's one room that's yellow that should be green, and I'm making those colors up. But there's ways to identify of something's not going on right here, or there's an issue here, and it'll be a teamwork between the district and the construction team. So that's being discussed. It has been discussed for the last few months.
Perfect. I think that was my question. Is the AC contractor ready?
Yes, absolutely. They have committed to it. They've been working in the buildings to correct where they can, understanding there could be an unknown that pops up, and they're committed to finishing the work.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Along with our cabinet team that has put so much work into the bond, we again thank you, Brian, and the entire Plant Moran Real Point team. Because literally, you and I were talking about this briefly before the meeting started, but we know how to do education in our various areas of expertise. But none of us in this room are experts at construction to the degree that Plant Moran Real Point is. And I can't even comprehend trying to undertake bonds this size without having an owner's representative such as Plant Moran Real Point, and you guys have been fabulous to work with. So thank you again for your support, because while you're doing all of the bond work that we are working with you on a team, the rest of our folks have got to do all the rest of their stuff. That's their responsibility. I mean, Mr. Francis has got 100 other things other than just bond things that he's got to take care of, and as does Mrs. Oquist and Mrs. Smith and so forth. But thank you again for being such a fabulous partner for the Livonia Public Schools throughout both of our bonds and sinking fund work. And we're thrilled to have you.
Well, thank you for those words. As I've said, it's a two-way street. It's a great team, and it takes a team effort. It is still a commitment to Mr. Francis's team, but it is.
It is. It's a gigantic group with a lot of people, but you're an important part of the team.
So another one, as you're saying that, one of the numbers that they were talking about, we calculated about $45 million of construction was completed in 2023 alone. So it was quite of the work you've seen here from May of 2021, $95 million has been spent, and so it has been a heavy lift. Regardless, if our team is here, there's a lot of asks of Ms. Oquist and Mr. Francis to get on their calendars, and we still need that participation and understanding of where this thing's going. So thank you to not only the board and the leadership. It's been a good partnership.
Absolutely. Any other comments or questions? All righty. We'll go on to the ECC playground site work, fencing, landscaping, 2021 bond.
If you wouldn't mind taking a look at this, it's just some sort of visual that will help. I don't know too far with my hip, but I don't need it.
And it's colorful.
With regard to, and this was actually on when we brought the playground furniture for ECC. This was part of the packet. I did not put it back into your packet, so I apologize for that. But what we're bringing to you this evening is actually a change order. It's to several of our contractors who are already on site at the Early Childhood Center working. It's the change order for them to do the work, as you would see on the sheet, in this general central area here. So we already have people that do concrete. We would be mapping out and doing the concrete here. We have landscaping that's in the package, but we need to do landscaping in this area. And once we have that actually drawn out, we can share that with the board as well. We have the fencing, which you can see on this document in the lower left corner. That may not be the exact manufacturer of the fence, but that's an example of, it's a nice looking black metal fence as opposed to a traditional cyclone, or what most people call a chain link fence in that area. So this is part of this package that we're coming to the board with in the amount of not to exceed $560,845. So that would be so that Clark can put change orders through to these different contractors. Yes, this is something that's been part of, it's not just for those who might be listening at home, this isn't something that we woke up recently and said, oh my goodness, we need to talk.
Thank you. I'm usually the one to talk to you. That we, came to the conclusion, oh, no, we don't have this. This was something that we've just been holding out for and plan to bring to the board in this fashion. Is there anything you wanted to add? Anything?
No,
I
yeah,
missed?
just to clarify, so there is a large packet of information here. This is what I would call a typical change order that internally we review, because we have a governance program set up, or governance document set up for the bond program. Anything that exceeds $100,000 for a contract, we have to notify Ms. O'Quist and the board as well. So that, understanding this was money that was set aside, we're now recommending asking for that approval to use those funds. So this is why it's different than a typical change order that we would normally see throughout the construction project. And as Mr. Francis had noted, there's added concrete work here. Once again, it was budgeted for site work and fencing. You'll see in the packet, there was competitive pricing. The fence was a larger scope of work that was beyond what our fence contractors, so we did ask Clark Construction to have their subs just competitively bid. So you'll see multiple quotes for the fence there to make sure we were getting fair and honest price for this work, just for the magnitude of it as well.
So if we've already approved this, why is this being called a change order?
It is money that is set aside in our budget for the bond program, but money that has not been approved by the board yet.
It wasn't part of the
Yes.
original packet
Yes.
from the time that we came with the ECC with these contractors.
Right.
Okay.
It was set aside, just because as we continued on, we wanted to make sure we had the right scope of the work as it came to form.
Okay.
So this was included in the budget, and we knew that we would be doing this work on this site. We brought the playground equipment early because we knew we had extensive lead time for that. So that already came to the board. What we were still working through was on the different areas, how much of this we were going to, for instance, put into phase 1 and phase 2. So where were we going to have grass? Where were we going to have concrete? Where were we going to have a
Turfed
turfed
areas,
surface?
et cetera.
Because quite a bit of this is going to be turfed surface. And we were really still working through the details of those elements. So we had budgeted a certain amount for the entire playground, including this. We used a portion of it for the playground equipment, and now the rest of
This is
it
the rest.
is ready to go for this. It would normally just simply be a bid and an approval, but because we have these contractors already under contract for this project doing other things. So they're pouring concrete, for instance,
Okay.
tomorrow in the mechanical area at ECC. So while they're on site, it will be much cheaper for them to also pour this entire sidewalk area that you see.
Right.
Now I
And
get
the trike trail. And so rather than having a separate contractor come in, it's much cheaper to, and you can see that in the bids, to have those contractors do it while they're on site.
Got it.
So that's why that would be a change
why it's
order
change order.
versus a bid, and then we're selecting that person.
Okay.
Does that make
That's
sense?
it's a great explanation,
Yep.
and it sounds a little wonky, but we didn't have the playground equipment yet. So how do you know what you're gonna lay the playground equipment on, how you're gonna run the sidewalks from the ECC itself?
Yep.
All of those things.
We do
So
the
we
rough
needed-
plans, now it's the detailed
Right,
plans.
now we needed that time, and even with this, we're gonna have more details because we don't actually have what kind of is there a, what type of, is there gonna be a pine sitting there, or is it a low-lying, different type of bush, et cetera, et cetera. Those we will have put together as well, and we'll share with the board when we have that information. So it's just sort of like a little bit of a reverse engineered type of item, knowing that we had the dollars and staying in that budget.
Okay. Mrs. Frank, do you have a question? That was pretty much it?
Yes.
I think this whole half the room was going, huh? Yes. Okay. Any other comments or questions on this section? Yeah, it's getting really exciting to see all these details coming in. Mrs. Frank?
I think this is a Mrs. Oko's question, and it is so exciting to see, but if you could just talk for a brief second on why it needs all to be fenced, because I think some people are gonna see some of this playground equipment and be so excited
Sure.
that they can bring their little ones over to play, but unfortunately, it's not gonna be available to the public because it needs to be fenced because
Right.
of the age of the learners.
Right, so we are meeting the needs anywhere from an infant to age 5 generally in this area. And so there are very stringent guidelines with regard to state guidelines and then our own local policies and practices. And so there will be actually not only the exterior part gated so that we do have an enclosed space for our students. So working with 2- and 3-year-olds versus working with students who are on a playground in an elementary school, that we can clearly state where the boundaries are. It's a little bit different working with toddlers. But even within the playground, there is also an area where you see the blue square. There's a 1 and a 4 there. That is actually a sectioned off area within the fenced-in area, because that will be for instance, our 1.5-year-old students. So even that area has a subdivided enclosure. And so it is very important that we have these protections for our students, that we have not only the visual protection that our staff provides, but very clear-cut boundaries that provide that safety barrier for students. Thankfully, right nearby, if folks are in the neighborhood, Nijiro has a beautiful playground, and that is open. And there will still be a lot of open space around this, but as far as that equipment, that will be for the ECC.
Thank you.
Sure, great
Mrs.
question.
Mrs. Oquist, and I'm not sure if this is you or perhaps Mr. Weber, I'm not sure. Is that going to have a physical gate? Actually, you know what, I think I might see one right over on the bottom, right near the red section. Or not even, so that it couldn't even
There's a
accidentally.
couple
go
of them
over
that
the-
are drawn.
Yes,
Yes, there will
there
be,
is another.
yes,
Yes.
there will be access gates for pedestrian traffic, I'll call it, or student, I shouldn't say pedestrian, for staff and students. There's also a couple service gates, so we can get equipment in for lawnmowers or anything like
Okay.
that. So those were talked about when locating gates.
Okay. I imagine that we meaning our staff and our students, will be accessing this playground from the building,
Yes,
correct?
Correct.
Generally,
Yes.
you would, this is right near the gross motor room, and we have a roll-up door in there, so you can come out with the trikes, et cetera, or from any of the other doors if you're coming from a classroom or one of the family rooms, et cetera. This is connected. You can see the white is the ECC building, and within that, if you follow where the fence line is
Okay.
going around, you can see quite a bit of it encompasses that. You can come right out from the building from multiple points and just be inside the fenced area of the playground.
So for instance, if you're in the mudroom or the family room here, and you're exiting in these gray areas and you see the 4 posts, you're starting to see those being built out right now. So there is a small canopy as you come out these areas, and then the concrete will go right out to that trike trail, and then go right out into those playground areas.
Got it.
Yep, and you may recall that we have some, you see the pictures as well, having the canopies for preschool. There are regulations. It's a year-round program. It's summertime. There has to be a certain amount of shade available to it. So we've had this designed specifically not for traditional elementary, but for the program.
And are those gates going to be kept locked? I hope so, that we don't accidentally have a gate left open and a little one. I mean, I assume since we are going to be, we meaning LPS and our staff, our children, are going to be accessing it from the building, that those gates under normal circumstances will be kept locked, so that.
I will have to answer your question with regard to whether or not they're latched or locked, because they also have to be a point of egress in a case of an
Okay.
emergency.
All
So
right.
they would not be padlocked, so to speak, if that's what you mean.
Got you,
But
okay.
latched so that a student can't get out, but
That
I
was my
believe they do
concern.
need to be accessible. We can get specifics on that
Okay.
from LAR guidelines, but they would not be padlocked, so to
Yep,
speak,
you're
but
right.
rather latched, so
Okay.
that you can exit if you needed to.
Okay, and then we'll
Does
just
that make
keep a good eye on them as the adults, to make certain that they are
Absolutely.
closed at all times.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yep, because little ones move fast. Mrs. Bradford?
Along those lines, we may want to put up some type of a sign that the grounds are for ECC students only or something. If that's not going to be locked or latched, you might still have families coming in, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. You know what I'm saying?
And
We
if
can
so,
have
and
procedures
if
as
so,
well.
why?
It can be locked after hours then, unlike just like
Sure,
a door to.
or however you deem it possible, but I'm just thinking, people that are walking their kids around might wander over and open up the
A tough day
latches
of
and.
shopping across the street at the mall. You have to come
Yeah,
on over. and-
exactly.
It is tough lately, isn't it?
Exactly. So just keep that in mind.
If we do have any signage to it, I would suggest that we put a brief explanation as to why, that's not accessible to the public. I mean, just, that verbiage can be worked out later, but
Yeah.
when people understand why, they're much more compliant. if they don't understand why we've got it locked, then they may be more frustrated.
Yeah.
Alrighty, any other comments or questions on this item?
This item will be voted on this evening, just
In our
so that
special
we know in
meeting.
You're
our
right, in
special
the special
meeting.
meeting, yes. Special meeting is going to follow
We can
this
get that
meeting.
clock ticking then on.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Next item is item 5C, the ECC contingency.
Yes. I'm going to invite our CFO, Mrs. Allison Smith, to join us as well. We had an extensive conversation.
Brian.
He's not
I
going
didn't
to,
think
Brian.
so.
Yeah, we had an extensive conversation about digging into the contingency request that was going to require board approval at our study session. I think there was an understanding of where we were and how we got there. I don't want to go down, I wasn't planning on going too deep down the rabbit hole because we did have a very extensive conversation at the study session last week, but certainly if there's questions or you want to point something out, what we were going to talk about was kind of at a little overview, higher level, and then it's really the vote for the moving of the contingency. So normally, when we have, and as we spoke about at the study session, we have dollars that are coming back from 2022 and 2023 bond projects that usually goes into owner's contingency, which Mr. Weber mentioned owner's contingency just a little bit ago when he was doing the quarterly dashboard. We're going to be requesting the board approve, instead of it going what is typically into there, but instead to the contingency of the Early Childhood Center to ensure we've got most things mapped out. We just want to make sure we have that safety net, as we talked about, to finish the project. We've come up against a couple of items that we weren't expecting, one having to do with electrical that we will get into. I think next month likely is when we'll be
Potentially, yeah.
bringing that
Yep.
potentially. So we can have that discussion at the time. But generally, we wanted to make sure that we've answered the board's question. We want to make sure that we talk a little bit for the public who hear this and wonder why are we moving. Normally, like I said, it goes into owner's contingency. We're going to ask for it to go into the ECC contingency. So I think we can just sort of, like we did last week, just give a kind of like more of the Reader's Digest. If anybody, I know we probably all know what that means, but a lot of people don't know what the Reader's Digest version is anymore. Give that conversation. Again, we can have whatever conversation the board would like. And ultimately, this was going to be an item that we are going to ask for. It wasn't just for information. It will be something that the board will vote on. And I would like to let you know now that I was going to ask, it didn't make it onto the special meeting, but with further conversations with Mr. Weber, it is advantageous if we didn't wait 2 more weeks so we can continue with the change order processes that need to be done. So I was going to ask for that as well. So I just want to lay all that out in front before we began our conversation on this topic. So, I started off.
President
Just a
Bradford.
quick question. So are we going to add that to this evening?
So we're going to have the discussion,
Okay.
and then we'll leave that up to the board if you're comfortable moving forward this evening.
Okay, and we'll have a motion for that? Is there
Yes.
somebody will?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks.
You want? I can jump in. So as we discussed last week, for our Early Childhood Center, we, as part of our initial package we brought to the board, recommended a 6% contingency for the project, which we knew was being pretty aggressive. But we thought with the overall cost of the ECC, what it was, that we wanted to be aggressive about, watching our costs and keeping the project on budget. And we have run into a few snags along the way with the Early Childhood Center. In particular, we kept a portion of the building, what used to be what would that be, the gym?
The cafeteria.
Cafeteria. And a lot of that has had to come down, and we've had to redo a lot back there, so we weren't able to salvage a lot that we thought we would be able to keep and fit into the new construction. We've had a number of things, like thinking back there with the flooring, what we thought we would be able to keep the cement flooring from the old center, and we found that there was water coming up through there. That wasn't something that we wanted to leave in place.
Some of the steel, we had issues, quite a bit of issues with the original steel in that part of the structure.
Yeah.
And overall, like Ms. Smith had mentioned, it was an aggressive ask, knowing where we were at the time. And then in addition to some of the stuff of the existing building, it has been on record actually as the wettest January on record. So with that comes additional site costs and stuff that is tracked not only by our team, but we have third-party engineers to make sure that we can't build on soft soil. So there's other sets of eyes out there, but inherently with the weather temperatures, we had to do a little bit more site work around the property as well that was not anticipated. So that also eats into contingencies as well.
So what we're proposing is getting your approval, if you are comfortable with that, bumping our contingency up closer to, I think it worked out to about 9.5% on the overall project. This definitely puts it in line with our other contingencies we've requested for past projects. Going back to 2013 bond, we were requesting 10%. We did come in a little lower with the 2021 bond with a 9% contingency, and I think this past summer, was it 7%? Something in that neighborhood. So we definitely think this would be, in line, and we're thankful for Cressa. Real Point. They obviously have a handle on this and what construction project contingency costs are around the state and what would be a good range, and they have reassured us that this is very much in line with what they're seeing, on other projects.
Part of the conversation, if you're calling, Mr. Terrell was with us at the study session. He had even stated that oftentimes 10 to 15 is standard, with 10 being the low end, and we're looking at as our coming to a higher end of a contingency. It all depends on the conditions, and it was unforeseen. Some of the conditions that we have at that building were unforeseen conditions.
And as always is the case with the contingency, this isn't a plan to then go ahead and tap into all those funds and use every penny of it. It's more to have that in case we need it, because we do have a number of months of construction still remaining, and we don't want to get to the point where we've spent everything that the board's authorized us to, and then we need to halt construction because we need to come back and get additional approval. We think it'd be the safest route to get approval from you now, continue to track the costs, very closely, and hopefully be able to report back to you later in the fall when we are closing out everything, what we are able to return back to our bond budget. But
in two items, just to reiterate that, and we had this conversation at the study session, but for any community that would be listening and watching this, much of this was unforeseen. It wasn't that we started a program and then said, hey, let's add this and let's add that. It really became a necessity to continue the work on the building, on the parts of it, on that original piece. And the second portion was just to reiterate that the dollars that we're talking about moving are dollars that were coming back to the bond from being good stewards of those dollars from the past projects that we had over the summer of 22 and 23. This is contingency money already that was approved for different projects that would normally go in, as I mentioned, to owner's contingency. So these are contingency dollars. It's what we're asking is simply, instead of putting it into one contingency area, let's bolster the ECC contingency with these dollars.
just to explain to how those contingency works, because I know that came up last week. Those aren't dollars that had been spent or given over to anybody. They were funds that were always in our possession, but were earmarked and we were able to spend on closing out other projects, but we didn't need those funds, so that they're coming back into our overall pot of funds within the bond that are available to cover this contingency request for the ECC.
Right, so it's really a reallocation from a financial booking of it versus them really going away somewhere and coming back from somewhere. It's really just a reallocation.
Okay. Comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Bradford?
I'm comfortable with putting that on our special meeting tonight, if that will help, due to not having a meeting until the 26th, so that would give us enough time. I feel comfortable with that. So I don't know if the rest of the board does, or
Yeah,
I'm fine
we're
with it.
okay with that?
I agree.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm perfectly comfortable with the concept of what we're voting on. These from day one have been contingency dollars, which means they're set aside for unexpected things or things that, the uh-ohs that happen, which we know will happen on every project. If they didn't happen on projects A and B within the same bond, I'm perfectly 100% comfortable moving over to where we are finding a little more than we expected on Project C, which, our ECC, for lack of a better term. But seeing as that was the purpose of those dollars in the beginning, is contingency. So moving them from one contingency pile to another contingency pile within the same bond, I am 100% comfortable with. Okay, we'll put that on the voting meeting for shortly, later on this evening. And what we're referring to is later this evening, we are having a special meeting to vote on a few items that simply would cause a problem if we waited a few more weeks, which we periodically do schedule a special meeting, and we'll just add this onto that so that those dollars are then able to be utilized.
Right away.
Yep. We're all set with that item?
Yes?
Okay, on to item 5D, the purchase of LMC furniture from the 2021 bond. Mr. Francis.
LMC furniture from the 2021 bond. This is for this coming summer of 24's work in the 5 buildings. We're looking at the furniture for the LMC. We've done this will be the 3rd time now. We've come to the board and talked about having a not to exceed number. So we have layouts, and that's in your packet. So we didn't have it on here or on the screen. They were packets, or they were all laid out. You saw the kind of the color schemes, what pictures
really
of the furniture, and then each LMC, Stevenson, Holmes, Hoover, Roosevelt, and Hayes, each one laid out. Now, I always chuckle a little bit because the designers like to lay out where all the furniture is in the space, but all of the furniture, as we know, is flexible, including the bookshelves that are on casters, except for the ones that are up against the wall. So it's just to show the scale of the space, to put some furniture in it and to say, this is what our plan is, and you can see how it can fit in these areas at the different LMCs. So it's really sharp. There's some different color patterns at each of the buildings. Looks really, really nice. As we've done traditionally, we have NBS is the NBS Commercial Interiors is the company that's procuring through French Associates the furniture. They use multiple contracts and consortiums to garner the pricing. So all the pieces that are in there are from multiple consortium contracts. I can read off the different ones we have. We have the NCPA, which is the National Cooperative Purchasing Alliance. We have pricing from Omnia Partners Cooperative Contract. TIPS, which is the Interlocal Purchasing System, and the E&I Cooperative Services. So all pricing, you have quite a large quote that's in your packet as well. So pricing's from all, multiple different contracts. And we are looking at $872,000. That includes a 5% contingency, and it's a not to exceed item. So this can we've already come with furniture that was the bookshelves previously, a couple months ago. This is now to start that order, to start bringing in the procurement of quite a bit of furniture for those 5 spaces. So if I've missed anything, please jump in, Mrs. Oquist or Mr. Weber.
No, you've touched everything. We internally as well, we do review of pricing, unit pricing, comparing previous years. We also do other districts at Real Point, so we have other resources. Some of you met Miss Lisa Pitt. She helps us to vet out unit pricing and quantities to make sure pricing checks out. So once again, it was a good process with French and NBS, and repeating what we've done before with bookcases, just due to lead times. We wanted that a couple months ago, and now finalizing furniture, or the soft seating portion.
And I just because late last week, just asked them to recheck again, make sure each building had the right pieces and the right numbers, all the math all came out, and they checked it again for us and said what we have in there is accurate. So we're looking pretty comfortable, but we do have a little wiggle room with that contingency in case we find, oh goodness, we need a little bit more over here or something like that.
And there are a couple of shade changes, so these are generally the designs, but there was one last review last week. So there are a couple of tweaks at a couple of schools, not that you can see it all that closely, but where you may see some patterns. It may have changed from a chair to a couch, or it may have changed from a seating element to the back of the seat. or a little less of a hue that you see in here. So these were the initial designs. There have been some tweaks. We did not have them re-render those designs.
Okay. Mrs. Bradford?
Thank you. That was what I was going to ask. When you're making a change in design color and everything, who's that done by? French and the building administrators? I mean, who is it that's choosing the colors in each of those units?
So French, from their design team, they have a designer who has been doing each year. It's the same person, actually, so she's very familiar with the building and the patterns we've been using. So we start off, just giving a quick run at it, is we let the designer sort of come in and say, okay, building X, we know what your school colors are. They've met with the principal multiple times during this design phase, the schematic design, and they might mention different things and say, boy, I see you have quite a bit of blue in here, and they say, yes, it's too much blue, or there's never enough blue, or whatever the case whatever the case may be. And so they put together a few different palettes and patterns, and frankly, we look at it.
They bring it first here.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we basically take a peek and say, this makes some sense, and then all of it's good. We're not looking to be super judgy. It's more along the lines of, just in case anything's a little, in case it's maybe a little too far off the reservation, and we say, maybe not that mustard or something like that,
Because
right?
you just don't want it to be ever on one group or one person, right? And so the reason that we initially look at it at a district level, when the designer first puts together multiple palettes, and is that we have the eye of having seen what we've done at each school, and what elements might work better in one space compared to another. And each of these media centers are relatively unique as far as their sizing, their spacing. And so then we'll give the general okay to perhaps 2 entire design palettes. And then they'll bring those out to the school. And then last week, they brought them back to us. We made just a couple of tweaks on some materials. Some of that may have some cost comparisons, so we want to stay within the budget. And so it really is a combined process. I would say the bulk of it by far takes place at the school level, but we do keep a district perspective on these prior to going out and before they are finalized.
Thank you, because that does help the community to understand, and the schools, the order and how we want it to progress, because you could get really quagmired down in colors. I mean, it can be difficult, but it's great to have French there to give you some different ideas, and then to have several sets of eyes.
It's important to have a starting point. When you start with nothing, a blank canvas, it's very difficult for people who don't do that for a living. So that's what we lean on them to just push that rock down the hill and get it started. And then it's easier to say, I would just like to swipe this for that, as opposed to coming up with it from scratch.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Mrs. Burton, we thought the community might like to see this, so
Absolutely.
Ms. Thompson is listening, and she's ready to put some of these renderings
great.
up on the screen. So, Mr. Francis, do you want to take, or do you want me to take them through? Can you see?
Please.
Okay. So we see Holmes Middle School here, and Holmes will have a design that incorporates the shelving units, a number of soft seating areas, as well as when you first come into the media center, and in addition to in the center of the media center, and then you see the flex classroom, as well as the book stacks, and then some separate small group collaboration rooms, similar to what you've seen at our other middle schools. So the color scheme in general is a little heavier on the green, because that is obviously their main school color. There will be a touch of blue, and a touch of, the mustard has been changed a bit to more of in the cooler family, in the grays and in the taupes, as opposed to the mustard, and then some different hues of blue just to soften the green, because there is quite a bit of green in the aesthetics of the ceiling, both the soffit and the acoustical panels. And so it's a nice blend of colors. And we can move on to Stevenson. And so this is Stevenson, as you know, double blue and white are the colors. It's a Columbia blue generally, a navy, a deep navy, and then actually they're also incorporating a gray or a silver as that white scheme. And so it's a very large area, similar to Franklin. There will be some booth seating along the window, soft seating and tables, high tops, low chairs with small tables and work tables near that area. We have the flex classroom, the book stacks, and then some collaboration group areas as well. Really nice color scheme. You aren't able to see the carpet on this rendering, but a really nice carpet that incorporates a light gray, a darker gray, and some of the blue tones as well. And it graduates as you move through the space. And so you see their school colors coming through. We're ready to move on, I believe, to Hayes. So Hayes is a much smaller space compared to a high school. And so they will have both the Idea Factory on the left. And so the Idea Factory has some unique seating and table elements, as you've seen with the larger butcher block tables, and as well as some work tables and the more colorful stools. I think they're called doodles. Aren't they called doodles?
Sure.
Okay. And then you see in the main library area, the book stacks, a little bit of soft seating. We have one larger sofa area, and then each of those little dots are called lily pads. So they're approximately 2 inches tall. They're about 12 inches, I think, in diameter, and they're a seating pad for each of the students. They can be put into stack keepers of 10, and so they get neatly put away, or they can be put out as a individual seating area to cluster the students for group instruction with the media specialist. And you see in the one, I don't know if you can't really see it in that picture. You can see where the stacks are, but we'll move on. Can you see that? To, to Hoover Elementary. So Hoover is a little larger media center. One difference you'll see at Hoover is that the Idea Factory is actually going to be housed where Project Lead the Way is now, and it's in a classroom that is immediately outside of the north end of the media center. And so in order to maximize the space in the media center, you can see we're taking over what was the computer lab area. That will be the flex classroom. And so just outside the hallway and across the hall will be the Idea Factory. So the furniture will be very similar. We're also adding some window panels of interest to that hallway wall. Because as you know, most of them are housed in the media center, and we have some of the different window patterns as just a point of interest when you walk through the media center. So we will be adding that to the hallway at Hoover for the Idea Factory, and then have those spaces both for soft seating as well as the little lily pads and the circulation desk in the center area of the media center. And we will move on to Roosevelt, which is the final. Right, we are at Roosevelt? Yes, we are at Roosevelt. And so at Roosevelt, you walk in through that center area, and you would walk right toward the seating area with the lily pads and two sectionals, portions of a sectional that can be, as they're shown right now, they're taken apart. Those can also be put together. So as Mr. Francis mentioned, all of this is flexible. The bookcases are. They can be moved literally from one end of an LMC to another. They are on casters, so they can be locked while they're in place, but once they're unlocked, all of this furniture can be very easily moved. And so that really is an appealing part of this, is that there is the mixture of the structured furniture that has flexibility and movement, as well as the soft seating. And then you see the flex classroom area that extends out into the media center. In all likelihood, at our K4s, they generally won't need those 2 extra rows of tables and chairs that you see. And so then the soft seating can be stretched out a bit and utilized for kiddos to grab a good book and sit down and read. And then you see the media specialist office to the right, and then it would go into the Idea Factory. Again, the mixture of seating that we've seen in the other schools as well. And so that is currently a computer lab, and that will be taken over as the Idea Factory. So that can be I believe, accessed from the hallway as well as from the LMC.
That's correct.
There's just a note I want to state. There's no furniture in the media specialist office. That is because it's casework. It's a built-in desk. That's what we've done in each office. So we don't want people to think that we aren't putting anything in there. For furniture, those are standalone pieces, but
Gotcha.
they have desk drawers and storage that will all be built in.
Any questions on these? That was just a quick run-through, but I thought,
Yep.
we thought
Looks
both
great.
you and the community would enjoy seeing what some of those designs incorporate, and really a ton of work on the school's part, on the teams here, as well as our designers to pull all of these together.
Questions or comments on this?
Thank you, Emily.
This, part of what's so exciting is the color schemes, and the fact that, you know, there's some consistency, but each school can do what works best for them. But seeing the color schemes and literally the flexible furniture, the fact that it can get moved from place to place, and that it is just so inviting. You know, we've been in a few of the LMCs already, and you walk in and even the adults just are excited to be there. So
Absolutely.
gone are the days of straight bookshelves and rectangle tables, and that's it.
Right.
It's a much more inviting space, so
Absolutely.
it's exciting to see. Mrs. Bradford?
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Can you touch on that last photo on the bottom there?
Oh,
There's
I
an
might have missed it.
additional
The Roosevelt front
Of-
office, the Roosevelt workstation.
office at Roosevelt?
There's a little bit of work in their office because it's furniture. It's part of the furniture package.
Okay.
A desk has to go back in there because we're moving a piece out. It's a little tight in the. I guess I should turn that on. It is a little tight in the Roosevelt main office.
Okay.
It's not super conducive. The mailboxes kind of stick out from the wall, and the copier is literally right behind the secretary who sits in the front. So whatever's on that person's desk or computer, anybody copying is right there. It was all just a little bit, it wasn't.
I do
Yeah,
know
it was
that
a little
office,
tight, so there's a little bit of movement. They had a storage space on the other side of their vestibule, and it had shelving in it, and Roosevelt had removed some of the pieces of shelving to make space, and we're gonna put the copier, the multifunction copier and printer in there, and the mailboxes in there. It sort of gives some breathing space, and we
great.
can then move the desk, which is more of a built-in. The first one's definitely a built-in. The one behind it is more of a modular piece, but we're gonna move that forward a bit, and they can get a little bit more space on that wall that's on the other side of the principal's office. So the furniture piece had to be recognized in the rendering for them whenever they're gonna buy a piece. That's why the office came in, because of that desk, and a couple other small pieces that they were gonna put around.
Perfect, thank you, thank
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah, it's, apologies, it's.
No, that's okay.
We just think of
at the
LMC,
end there,
LMC,
You
LMC, yeah.
have to really blow it up. I couldn't figure out where it was, so I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
it'll be nice. It'll give them a little bit of elbow room, and it'll make a better pathway from when adults and children come in to the main office. You sort of have to hook around the mailboxes that are jutting off the wall, and then you kind of come on back. And there's no real place for a child to sit, to wait, to talk to, either wait for the parent to pick them up or to talk to the principal or whatever the case may be. So we're cleaning that up. That was one of their wish list items, just to clean up.
Got it.
Thank
And this
you.
is another item that we've asked for voting this evening, so we certainly appreciate
Sure.
the board's work with that, because without a meeting next week, it puts us out till February 26th, and we really would like to have this furniture in
Class
place
started.
to
Absolutely.
get going for the
Get it on
start of
order.
school.
Totally
So a couple weeks
understandable.
makes a big difference.
Yep, thank you.
All righty. Next item on our agenda is 5E, the network switch replacement from the 2021 bond.
You can hang
You're
on,
on
you
way.
can go whatever you want to do. No, you can go.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your
Thank
time.
you, Brian.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Brian, thank you.
See ya.
So network switches, these are all of, every building that we have has a tech closet. And then there's even in larger buildings, additional tech closets off of the main one, because you can never go more than 300 feet away to be able to have your Wi-Fi. So these switches are what runs everything in our district when it comes to the internet, and of course, the internet is basically running our phones and so many, other, everything is probably the right word. So the network switches that are in those tech closets, in those network closets, we've got those. That was an earlier purchase from the 2013 bond. So it's time to replace and update those. So what we're looking at is, this was a planned item from the 2021 bond to replace these. We went out to bid, and the low responsible bidder, IDS, is our technology consulting firm. They had assisted the district with this bid. And in your packet, you saw a letter from IDS as well that had recommendations. You saw another letter from Mr. Klan, who's our administrator of IT, and then mine as well. So essentially, we had one mandatory alternate. So we asked everybody who was going to bid to put that in, and then there were some other voluntary alternates. When it's all totaled up, the alternates that we chose to accept in conjunction with the base bid came out to $1,852,349.15, which is including the 5% contingency for this project. So the switches will get, I can't think of another word, traded out. I don't want to say
There
that.
we go. Traded.
Swapped out by Sentinel. Sentinel Technologies is a company that I'm sure we've all heard many times. They've done quite a bit of work in the district. We're very comfortable with Sentinel, the work they've done. They have a very good track record and history with LPS, and we have good working relationships with them. They've been in our buildings over and over again and helped on many projects. These switches basically control all of the traffic that runs through the district. And over the years, we've improved redundancies in our district's network. So we, over the years, through projects approved by the board and through the funding of the bonds, we've been able to have a redundancy that double loops the district. So if we get cut off years ago, as Mr. Klan and I were just having this conversation last week, years ago, if a line got cut somehow, a squirrel chewed on it, which, by the way, we also have special things on those lines now that try to prevent squirrels from chewing them, because we have many of those. It would cut out every building that looped past that building, and they all lost their network. Now that we've have redundancy, the network can then turn and be looped back the long way, if you will, to those buildings that would have originally been out. So really only have that one building that might be down. So it's really, and then nowadays there's, it's called power over Ethernet. So our phones, for example, we have to have a special switch that would power the data outlet, the data port in, say, my office that's right by my desk. I have to have that one special data port because I have to put my phone Ethernet in there, which not only gives me the internet for my phone, but also the electrical power for my phone, right? So that was a less common item, and those were special switches. Nowadays, power over Ethernet is a more common item. So many more switches at a cost that was less than they used to be. We can afford those, and that would give us more expanded capability to run items, which more and more commonly are being created, that are run power over Ethernet. So it's an all-in-one single plug-in with that data port. So all of this upgrade is really, it is an important item for the district. Without a strong running network, we would be in jeopardy. We'd have issues. So, because things like our phones, we have backups for those, but we want our Ethernet to work properly, and in the heart of that are all of these switches. So that might have been more than most people wanted to know about switches, but I thought it was important because it really is the heart of all of our, our copiers, our phones, our cameras. Everything now is running off the switches.
Okay. Questions and comments on this? Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. What's the time frame on this, Phil?
I will have to confirm with Sentinel. We want to make sure that they're able to get into those buildings. And generally speaking, summer is better, also evenings. So I can get an update for you. I want to make sure. I'll talk to Mr. Klan and Mr. Maury from IDS to map out what their intended timeline was.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or questions on this?
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. I'm just so surprised that 10 years have already gone by.
Yeah,
And
I
we're
know.
looking at replacing this again. I mean, to me, that's amazing, but
It is.
it has to be done.
Yep.
That is electronics, but
Yep.
it's expensive, but obviously, we need to have it, so
Yep.
that's good. And this will be for our meeting on the 26th?
Correct.
Okay, so we're not doing that
Correct, thank
tonight.
you.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty, any other questions on this item? Alrighty, seeing none, we'll go to the next item, which is 5F, elevator renovation at the administration building. For those of you at home who don't understand, you haven't been in the elevator lately. It needs an update.
It needs an update. We've had some issues with it getting stuck the last several years. We do have it get repaired. We've got, actually down in this level of the building is the mechanical room for the elevator. That would get, in this proposed project, and this would be from capital projects, that would get completely replaced because it's really an outdated, 1990 is when this was put in. So that's been quite some time for that elevator. We've certainly gotten our use out of it. It's a simplistic elevator system, and it's an outdated elevator system. So even when we try to have repair folks come and say, this doesn't even exist anymore. So we felt it was the right time to just say, wow, 34, 35 years is pretty good. Let's move forward. We're fortunate to have the capital projects under the stewardship of the finance office with Mrs. Smith. We've got that for these one-time types of purchases. So what we're looking to do is ask the board for the project of the renovation came in on a quote of $228,500. That's literally outside of the shaft itself, which remains everything that would be different. So the box itself, it would be a cable system, so you wouldn't feel that push from that hydraulic. It would be a different system completely. The room that's down here would get redone with new mechanics, so it'll be a new mechanic room. So that's the sort of the entire, having it not refurbished, but literally replaced and updated to today's, expectations. Again, this was from capital funds. Kone is it's a large, well-known company that we work with quite a bit. We've had repairs done by them. They're in Livonia. If you looked at their quote, it says Detroit office, but it's actually, if you look at their address, they're local here in Livonia. So we work with them quite a bit when we do have questions about that piece of equipment. We're looking at a summertime start for it. There's always the concern of, is something going to be a little delayed? Is there a part here or there? But right now, as Mr. Lau had spoken with the company, they're looking at having it hopefully start somewhere in the summer, which would be ideal. Of course, the time that it takes them to make this completed job, we're not going to have that elevator. So, we'll put notices on our doors here at the building, letting folks know, that it's out of order. So they would know, be forewarned if there was a need for elevator, for a lift. We'll just try to work together and work around any other items that need to go up and down with regard to, carts, et cetera. So.
Comments or questions on this item?
It'll be nice.
Yes, it's just necessary at this point.
I didn't think I was needed to oversell it. I don't
Nope.
want to make it sound bad, but
Nope.
it definitely needs, I think all of us who have been in it know that it needs some help.
Yeah,
Mechanical help. It looks fine when you're inside of it. It's the mechanical help.
yeah. For the folks for whom it's necessary, it's really necessary.
Absolutely.
So it needs
Absolutely.
to be done. All right, and this will be on the agenda for the 26th?
I actually had
Or is
this
that
tonight,
tonight?
so we can
It's
get,
tonight's
yeah, because
agenda,
every
okay.
couple of weeks, I'd like for the clock to start because
Okay.
I'm trying to get as much of it, as high a chance to have it done in the summer as possible.
Got it.
So every week would count to get the ball rolling.
Okay. And no other questions on this item? Alrighty. President Bradford, that concludes Building and Site.
Great job, Mrs. Burton. Okay.
Thank you.
And good job, Mr. Francis, of course. Let's move on to item 6, the Policy Committee. Mrs. Frank?
Nothing for us this evening.
Okay, thank you. Item 7, Personnel Committee, Mr. Johnson.
I don't think we have anything.
We do not.
in personnel. No, we have nothing, President Bradford.
Thank you, Vice President Johnson. Item 8, Legislative Committee, Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you, President Bradford. We have one item tonight. Mrs. Oquist will walk us through the governor's executive budget.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Jarvis. I'm really just going to reiterate what I shared with you via email last week with regard to a high-level summary. I will just give the cautionary comments that we normally do at this time, which is this is the initial proposal by the governor. It's a very aggressive budget. It takes the budget surplus from $9 billion to $19 million. So it utilizes just about all of the budget surplus. So in order for this to go through, that would have to be what is voted on by the Senate and the House. So the Senate and the House still need to put their proposals forward. That will come probably in late April. And much of what we've been told, while there was a request to have this budget be passed in May, in all likelihood, this will be a stretch till the end budget. There are some big asks in the budget proposal, and it really is we'll need to have some extensive discussion with regard to the utilization of that budget surplus. So I'll just give the high-level overview, and the first recommendation is a 2.5% increase on the foundation allowance. So while that would not match inflationary increases, we would have about a $241 per pupil increase. That is lower than we've seen the past 2 years, but that is in line with what Mrs. Smith and I shared with you last year in anticipation of that dollar amount not being able to be sustained in that $400, $450 range. That would bring the per pupil allowance up to $98.49, again, if it were passed at that rate. There is also a 5% increase in all of the categoricals that have been included in recent past, the at-risk dollars, so that would be 31A, Special Education Foundation, the GSRP slot allocations, English language learners, ISD operations, and CTE categoricals. So there's about $125 million total in those 5% increase in those areas. You may recall that last year, the state added a categorical for transportation. Previously, school districts have received no dollars toward their transportation costs. That was to be taken out of the per pupil educational funding for a student. One of the things that we saw through the School Finance Research Collaborative report is that without any dollars allocated for operational upkeep, such as the work we're doing with this bond, or transportation, those costs are truly coming out of the dollars that are intended to educate our children. And so without a separate categorical, we're using general fund dollars. So we did receive a transportation categorical last year, so the governor is recommending that $125 million be continued for this year. There is a big proposal to have $1.7 billion contribution to MIPSers. So that would not only include a rate reduction from 20.96% to 20% for school districts, it would also look to, I believe, put about $670 million toward paying down the MIPSers debt and that unfunded liability. That is a significant portion of the surplus, and so that would be a big ask and a tall mountain to climb, but that is what is included. $45 million increase to CTE programming, which includes equipment purchase and added costs. As you know, we do have the ability to write grants or to receive funding for both equipment and added cost dollars for our Livonia Career Technical Center and our CTE programs. She's recommending a $50 million increase to Section 56, which is the special education equalization. And then I believe you've probably heard this in the news, certainly, the idea to have preschool available at no cost to all students in the state. How that will be done is still to be determined, but it looks like that would be through additional slots of GSRP. And there's been discussion anywhere from raising the cap to eliminating a cap with regard to income in order to qualify for GSRP. But regardless of that, the intent is for those dollars to first meet the needs of families in need, if that makes sense. So even if there is not a cap, that either districts or ISDs are going to be expected to find a way to first fund students who would meet those guidelines. And then $200 million to continue the healthy meals, the free breakfast and free lunch. That has exceeded the estimated costs that they had when they started this year, and so there are additional dollars to continue to fund that into the future. So those are just some high-level overviews. Again, this is one leg of three. We'll get the Senate and the House versions, and then I am going to make a somewhat educated guess that there's going to be lots of
A lot of movement.
lots of discussion, lots of committee work, and conversations among different appropriations committees with regard to where we end up. I do feel comfortable that, in general, the House and the Senate over the past handful of years or more have at least matched, if not exceeded, the per pupil funding amount. So just that foundational allowance piece has generally not been lower. And so I think it gives us a good starting point. As I shared with you in my update, we have our first budget planning session this week as a cabinet team. We will continue with several of those before we come to the board, but it does give us a decent starting point as far as that per pupil funding. It's really, I think our concern overall as school leaders is where does it put some of the newer categoricals, like the Section 97C, some of the safety money that was built into the 31AA this year. The legislature built together the security dollars and the mental health dollars, and so that was a pretty significant new categorical. My understanding is that will be funded for one more year and then cut in half for the following year. And so the things we need to be thinking about when we bring recommendations to you is, if we're going to use those dollars on people, then we need to be cognizant that that funding would not remain at that rate beyond next year. However, obviously, when you think about mental health support, you are talking about people. You're generally not talking about things. But when you're talking about security, oftentimes you can make purchases like we have with our bus cameras and our security systems at our schools. So we'll always continue to look to balance that between ongoing and recurring revenue and expenditures versus what we think might be limited or one-time.
Are there any questions for Mrs. Oquist?
Just one. Mrs. Oquist, as with any other legislative-oriented thing, if and when there's action that would be beneficial for the board to take, please let us know.
Absolutely.
Okay. I know it's a little early yet.
It'll be coming.
And that's all for the Finance Committee?
Thank you, Ms. Jarvis.
I'm sorry, the Legislative Committee? Gosh,
Oh, yes.
guess who's tired?
Jarvis. Okay, at this time, I think Good evening and welcome back. We are going to have a special meeting of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Ed for February 12th, 2024. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Here.
Mrs. Burton?
Here.
Mrs. Frank?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mrs. Acosta here. President Bradford?
Here, and we have a quorum. We're going to go on to item 2, audience communications. I do not have any blue slips, so we will go ahead and go right into item number 3, which will be the approval of the ECC Playground Site Work Fencing Landscaping Project 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from its owner's representative, Plant Miranda Real Point, and its construction manager, Clark Construction Company, to approve the change orders for the contractors identified to provide and install playground site work, concrete, fencing, and landscaping for the Early Childhood Center in the amount of $560,845, which includes costs for hard construction, fees, and contingency.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of the ECC Playground Site Work Fencing Landscaping Project for the 2021 bond, and we'll hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're welcome.
As spoke of earlier this evening, this is from the 2021 bond ECC project, and this is a recommendation for approval of change orders for current contractors. This was money that has been budgeted for these projects for the ECC's playground area, and we do recommend to the board approval of this so we can continue working on the playground area, I should say, at ECC.
Are there any questions? Remember, we just spoke of this at the meeting previously this evening, so if you are interested in learning more about it, please go see that meeting or re-watch that committee of the whole meeting. All right, so we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of the ECC Playground Site Work Fencing Landscaping Project 2021 bond. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carried. That takes us to item 4, the approval of purchase of LMC Furniture 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Real Point, and approve the Phase 3 purchase of furniture for library media centers at Hoover Elementary, Hayes Elementary, Roosevelt Elementary, Holmes Middle School, and Stevenson High School from NBS Commercial Interiors, Troy, Michigan, in an amount not to exceed $872,000.
Support.
We have a motion from Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the approval of purchase of LMC Furniture 2021 bond. And we're going to hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you again. The LMCs at these locations are being renovated this summer via the 2021 bond initiative. This new furniture that is mobile and flexible will be required for the renovated spaces. The pricing comes from multiple purchasing contracts, which fulfills the board's requirement to bid.
Thank you. Again, are there any questions from Mrs. Burton?
Just a comment that a few of these purchases that we're talking about tonight, we did, as you said, discuss extensively, including some pretty interesting photographs and so forth, in case people are interested to see the committee of the whole meeting, and you'll get a lot of detail on all these items.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we have a motion from Mrs. Bonifield, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the approval of purchase of LMC Furniture 2021 bond. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Support, yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to item 5. This is the approval of elevator renovation project at Administration Building. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Acosta.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation to replace the elevator and its mechanical system at the Central Office Administration Building from Kone Incorporated, located in Livonia, Michigan, in an amount of $240,000, which includes contingency.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Vice President Johnson, for the approval of elevator renovation project at the Administration Building. And again, we'll hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you again. Well, the elevator here at the administration building at the board office is 34 years old, as discussed earlier. It is the original equipment, and it has had for several years reoccurring issues. So it is my recommendation that it have a full replacement, and the pricing for this project from Kone is from Omnia Partners Purchasing Contracts, which fulfills the board's requirement to bid, and we will be using the funds from the capital project funding.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Again, this was discussed in detail at the previous meeting here this evening, so that's why there's not a whole lot of discussion about it. We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Vice President Johnson, for the approval of elevator renovation project at the Administration Building. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Yes.
President Bradford.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to item 6, the second reading of Board Policy Personnel GBF Teacher Placement. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy GBF Teacher Placement.
Support. We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading of Board Policy Personnel GBF Teacher Placement. And this evening, I believe we're going to hear from Mr. Abati.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
So, as to reiterate for you and for the add for the community, we did have a series of policies that we're looking at tonight as a second reading that will bring us in line with changes to the law. GBF in particular is about teacher placement. It defines the concept of teacher placement as the determination of a teaching assignment for a teacher. It references the certifications required to be qualified for those positions and also the permitting possibility for someone who might not be certified through the state. Pretty straightforward for teacher placement.
Thank you, Mr. Abati. Do we have any comments or questions from the board? All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading, Board Policy Personnel, the GBF Teacher Placement. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford.
Yes, motion carries. Moving on to item 7, the second reading of Board Policy Personnel GBG Staffing Layoff and Recall of Teachers. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Vice President Johnson.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy GBG staffing, layoff, and recall of teachers.
Support.
We have a motion by Vice President Johnson, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the second reading of Board Policy Personnel, GBG, staffing, layoff, and recall of teachers. And again, we're going to hear from Mr. Abadi.
Yeah, so again, we're laying out procedures which we should note are not significantly different than anything we've done prior. But these now will be written in such a manner that they are directly compliant with changes to the law. This particular policy defines the concept of a personnel decision, what constitutes a personnel decision, things like filling a vacancy, placing a teacher, conducting layoff, recall, those types of items. Again, it lays out our processes for how we would go about making those decisions, taking into account primarily effectiveness ratings, length of time in service, and special training, those types of items that you would run down in a list to make an appropriate decision in each of these situations when you're staffing, laying off, or recalling employees.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Vice President Johnson, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the second reading, Board Policy Personnel, GBG, staffing, layoff, and recall of teachers. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. Moving on to item 8, the second reading of Board Policy Personnel, GBIA, teacher evaluations. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy GBIA teacher evaluations.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading of Board Policy Personnel, GBIA, teacher evaluations. And again, Mr. Abati.
Yes, teacher evaluations, as it would suggest, is about how we evaluate staff. Our prior policy simply said we would follow the law, which is just a one-liner, essentially. This now lays out more specifically what is in the new law. Again, the process is going to be very similar. The system as it exists right now will not change until the summer. Until July. So the primary change that we've captured here to be in compliance with the law is a change to the actual ratings titles. We used to have highly effective, effective, minimally effective, and ineffective. We'll now be moving to effective, developing, and needing support. So those are captured in here, so we won't have to make an adjustment in the summer when things switch over to the new system. And we now have everything that is required by law laid out here in our policy.
Thank you, Mr. Abadi. Any questions or comments? No. Seeing none, we have an approval by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading, Board Policy Personnel, GBIA, teacher evaluations. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carried. This evening, we are going to add on an item, thank you, Mr. Abadi and Mrs.
Thank you.
Keats. Sorry about that. All right, this evening, we are going to do an add-on from our previous committee, the whole meeting. We all decided that this approval is necessary for us to move forward due to the time constraints of our next meeting, which is not until February 26th. So we are adding this on. This will be item 9, and it will be the approval for contingency for Early Childhood Center addition and renovation 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Real Point, to approve additional contingency for the Early Childhood Center addition and renovation project in the amount of $950,000.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of contingency for Early Childhood Center addition and renovation 2021 bond. And we're going to hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you very much. This request for additional contingency will increase the overall project contingency amount from 6% originally to now 10%, and is being requested to ensure that no delays occur due to unforeseen construction issues. The additional contingency requested will be fully funded by available contingency funds unspent and remaining from the 2022 and 2023 bond projects.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Is there any questions or comments?
No.
Okay, seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of contingency for Early Childhood Center addition and renovation for the 2021 bond. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. All right, and our last item this evening is item 10, our adjournment. Is there anything else that we need to bring before the board this evening? Okay, then we're adjourned. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.